It is 6:45, and we have a public hearing for the budget, and I will read the document, the city budget message for the record, and then we'll open it to the floor for anyone who has any questions or comments about the budget. Dear citizens and Board of Council, City Administration met with the Finance Committee of Council to review this proposed budget and have submitted a favorable report, which recommends adoption by this Board of Council. The fiscal year 2023-2024 is a continuation of the city's implementation of several projects, many of which stem from the community plan. This budget also includes the expenditure of much of the city's American Rescue Plan Act ARPA funds on projects ranging from playgrounds to streets. Outside of larger projects, this year's budget also includes the annual street resurfacing program, scheduled vehicle and equipment replacement, and wage increases for city staff. The fiscal year 2023-2024 budget covers all of the necessary operating expenses for the city, from wages to janitorial supplies. The fiscal year 23-24 general fund revenues are projected to exceed expenditures after transfers by $1,212. Our projected general revenue operating revenues total $15,152,274, which is a 5.7% increase over fiscal year 22-23. While our budgeted revenues have increased, specifically some of our business tax estimates, the city still maintains a policy of conservative revenue projections. This allows us to build a reserve that we can reinvest in capital improvements. The fiscal year 23-24 budget includes the expenditure of over $1 million in reserves for public projects. General fund operating expenditures total $17,971,062, a 28.3% increase over fiscal year 22-23. While this number looks large, it reflects a change in where the city is expensing park projects. Previously, these projects were charged to a separate fund, but now they're charged to the Parks and Green Space Department, where they'll be more easily tracked. If you remove those expenditures, the average increase is roughly 3% across all general fund departments. That increase is primarily due to wage increases and additional health insurance costs. There's very little discretionary spending as in years past. Other funds. The remaining city funds cover a variety of city operations and projects. The KDOT Road Fund houses the city's street resurfacing program and also larger ARPA-funded projects like the reconstruction of Kyles Lane. Our health insurance fund was created to account for our self-funded insurance plan. The only fund which shows a large difference is the CBD fund. This fund was previously used as the cost center for the city building project, the Tower Park softball field, and streetscape improvements in the center of town. As those projects are all completed, or will be by the end of June, this fund will handle only city events and the farmers market. So this, in summary, overall, the fiscal year 23-24 budget continues the city's focus on providing both a high level of service and great amenities to our citizens. Through a combination of reserves, grants, and federal funds, we've been able to improve our parks, buildings, and infrastructure and do it in a way that will keep the city on sound financial footing well into the future. For 156 years, the city of Fort Thomas has been a great place to live, work, and raise a family, and we are thrilled to build on that past while looking into the future. Respectfully submitted, Eric Haas, Mayor, Pat Kramer, City Administrative Officer, and Joe Ewald back there, the Director of Finance. So that is our message, and if anybody would like to ask any questions or have any comments, this is the public hearing portion for the budget. So if anybody would like to make a comment, please come to the podium and state your name and address.
We signed in. Did you want the sheet?
The signing in is for the city meeting later. This is specifically just for the budget.
This is this.
Just budget.
Yeah,
That's fine. You know.
Oh, okay. I thought we needed this. I'm just helping. Okay. Thank
thank you for everything that you've prepared thus far. It's a nice building as well here.
Name and address, please, sorry.
Tiffany Huber, 26 Hawthorne Avenue.
Thank you.
I see some things missing in the budget.
Can you put? There we go.
Usually I don't need a microphone, but I see some things missing in the budget based on the input that's been provided by the residents, probably over the last 5 years. And I want to take a few minutes to discuss that. Over the weekend, and I wanted to share this with you. Did you get a copy?
Yes, I
These same residents that have been providing this feedback put together just an 8-question yes or no survey. We got 282 responses about what kind of things that we would like to see, if you will, budgeted for our city, and as well as the focus of our city. And I thought it was a great response for 2.5 days. What it also shows us is that as we move into the future, there's a lot of ways that we can get feedback from our residents, and it doesn't have to be what I think or what you think. It can just be what the community, the 17,000 people think. And as I looked at these, this survey, which again took less than a minute for people to actually fill out, it kind of validated what we've been asking for the last 5 years. One is the transparency and the communication and the website, and you guys have made incremental changes to the website. But when you compare it to what we're looking at across other cities, we're not near as far along on that website 5 years later where we need to be. And so to me, that's one of the reasons we put the full-time communications media director that we'd like to see in the budget, because we feel like, based on these responses, that it provides communication to the residents and to the businesses and to the entire community. It allows us to have different modes of communication to the different individuals in terms of how they need their communication. Older people, and they may not be as technology savvy, and may want it by mail, and other people may want push notifications from the website, as we talked about. But if you add the regular mail, or if you add email with the push notifications from the city website, 64.54% wanted basically something by some form of email or text or something like that. So we're still asking for these things to be put in the budget. We need it. We need it now. We needed it yesterday, and we're imploring each of you to help us achieve this and get this in the budget. The other thing that we've asked for, which is also about communication, we have to work for all residents. Those residents who are raising families, or they may have somebody who's not well, or they may have somebody who just cannot make it to this meeting. We need to make sure that we're posting all of our meetings on these different platforms so that we give everybody the opportunity to understand what's going on with our city. And so I think for those reasons, probably 4 or 5 of these can all be put into one. Having a communications director, and I know we also talked about at one of the meetings, somebody got up and volunteered to assist with communications, and I don't believe that we ever took that person up on helping the city. And clearly the city does not have the wherewithal of all the other projects going on. But this is a critical need, and we're asking you to please finally do something about this. It's necessary. I think the second thing is, we're thinking maybe as part of the budget that we need a residence board, where we have somebody that works on the residents' behalf, and it's paid for by the city. This happens in other cities as well, so that we can focus on continuing to beautify our city. Not just, there's people that don't want to pay 100%, or 50% for the street resurfacing. Having those streets done beautifies our city. That's critical. And one of the biggest things that's important here is for us to have the historic preservation. Because if you look at the survey, it said that 97% want to retain our city's beautiful residential homes, its existing buildings, its park-like settings, and its small town charm. So we need somebody to be sitting on our boards. We need those boards to be trained. Again, these I think are two major things, and we're all in this together. It can't be rich versus poor, or some get what they need and others don't. We're really looking for the entire community to get what they need from the city. And this city has provided a lot to us, and we need to keep making sure that we protect it and preserve it.
I have a quick question. You said that other cities are doing a residence board. Which other cities do that?
I believe that Hyde Park is doing a residence board. I don't know that it's paid for by the city,
Okay.
but I can get some additional research to you for that. I just also want to show you how powerful doing something. I didn't even know how to use SurveyMonkey on Friday night. And I put this together, and it's because I care. The people that are showing up to these meetings care.
Great, thank you very much. Would anyone else like to address the budget?
Yes.
I'm Sharon McKnight, 62 Miller Lane. Thank you all for all your service and taking the time for taking in our input. I also want to say thank you to Joe Ewald for taking the time to explain the many questions I had about our budget. I feel it would be quite beneficial for the entire community if there could have been a town hall type of meeting or several meetings like that explaining this budget prior to this budget public hearing. It only makes sense to have the community fully informed about the budget before they get up and speak on it. So I think the communication director would help tremendously with that. So I want to just thank Joe for his help. Also, let's see, I think, is the ARPA funding spent already? Is it already earmarked? Do we have a say about this at all?
It is earmarked, right?
We don't have a say at all?
All the projects that are in there, we've had them at, council meetings, committee meetings, and it's all discussed.
I know, but did you have any community outreach to the community, how
Yes,
they needed relief? Because I didn't get any, and I was at the meetings.
Most of those plans were done through the community plan, which has been our roadmap since we finished the community plan. And then it's council's decision to look at that community plan and decide how to implement it and how to pay for it. So that's why we're elected to do this job. We try to communicate as much as we can. Obviously, we can do that better. But there is a point where some information, that's our responsibility. Just like the guys here tonight who are part of planning and zoning, that's their responsibility. Certainly, feedback from people is absolutely welcome at all times, but there's only so much we can do as far as getting a lot of that information out. The ARPA funds has been discussed for several years now.
I know.
Once we found out the limitations of it. And in the beginning, we all wanted to spend it. Ron Dill was being very cautious and said, well, you know what? They've got all kinds of limits on what these funds can be for. Let's wait until they come up with the rules. And once the rules were done, we found out we had a lot of flexibility in what
Yes.
we could use.
January 22nd, that's when they came out. I followed that as well.
Yeah.
All due respect, the comprehensive plan came out in 2018. The pandemic hit in 20, and so you had no clue the hell we went through. So I'm just saying, if you had a communications director that really did community outreach, you would really have a better understanding what kind of relief was needed. Okay? That's all I'm saying. That just has nothing to do with the comprehensive plan. Do you understand what I'm saying? Community outreach is so important to the community, so you have the right information for this funding. And that's the way I look at it. I follow all of this, I know it all, came into place on January 22nd, 22. That in May, I got hit with a 57% increase on my PDA. I had no help from anybody. I had a real estate agent step up to help me to get the help I needed to bring mine down. But I just think, just emphasizing on what Tiffany's saying, the communication just needs to be improved. If you could hire a director or media specialist, I mean, like now, that would be helped tremendously. I also have a question about the industrial revenue bonds that we have. Do we have more than just one, besides the one on One Highland, that's not in the tax base?
The only other one I'm aware of is, the, VA homes.
Okay,
Yeah,
so they
There
don't,
may be others, I don't think there is.
does anybody know? Joe, do you know?
No, there are only two. There's the industrial revenue bonds for One Highland and the industrial revenue bonds for the VA homes. That's it.
Okay, and so the VA homes don't pay, or not in the tax base either?
No, not for the life of the bonds. They are not.
And why is that? Can someone explain that to me, what the benefit of is for the taxpayers, please?
There is it's called a pilot payment.
Yes,
And it's a payment in lieu of taxes, that's what the pilot, P-I-L-O-T stands
Yes.
for. So the people back in the VA homes, they actually pay taxes, but they pay the pilot payment. It's
You do.
actually a long-term lease until the IRB is done. It's the same thing with the other building. They're paying a pilot payment, which then comes to the city, and that's all negotiated when the IRB is put out there. So the city does get money from both projects. It's just not officially tax dollars, it's a pilot payment instead.
is it the same amount of money, like if you got the $22 million at One Highland, if that was put in the tax base, are we getting that same amount of money?
Here's what I would suggest.
Okay,
It's super complicated.
I know it is, that's why I'm up here asking.
No,
And these people probably would like to know too. I mean,
yeah, and what I can do is sit down with the attorney who actually handled all of that for the city. I would be kidding you if I said I could even begin to give you an adequate explanation, but I can't. It's way out of my bailiwick. Only a few attorneys in the area that really handle IRBs. I can sit down with Jim Parsons, the gentleman who handled it for the city. And first of all, we would sit down with you, get questions, try to brainstorm about things that would be of interest, and then meet with Jim and report back and try to give you that information. I can't do it tonight.
Okay,
I can just give you a quick explanation of what happened with the IRB at One Highland. I read all of the documents. There's a whole bunch of different documents that reference each other, and they're all about an inch thick. So typically in an IRB, there is the pilot payment you're talking about. And the pilot payment, which stands for payment in lieu of taxes, it's formulated the same way you would use, the same formulation you'd use to figure out how much you owe on your property tax.
yes,
So they use the same method to figure out how much that pilot payment would be. However, with the One Highland IRB, that whole amount is actually, the city does receive the amount, but then we turn around and give it to a bank that uses the money to pay off and service the bonds. So the city only gets to spend any amount over $330,000. So if you add up the asking price of all the One Highland units, I think you have to sell them at a little above asking price for there to be, using the current tax rate formula. And part of that is because the compensating rate actually went down after that IRB was negotiated. So we're not quite getting as much money as maybe they anticipated from the beginning. But we won't see, the city won't get, we get the money, but then we take the money, and from what I've read, maybe one of these attorneys can enlighten me, but this is what I read, that we turn around and use that money to service the bond, so we don't get to spend the money.
So it does, as a taxpayer, nothing for us right
Well,
now.
The way I read it, and reading about the compensating rate. So the compensating rate goes up and down based on how your property value increases. So a city, I believe, is only allowed to, increase by 4% a year. Is that right?
Compensating plus.
Yes, compensating plus 4. So if the tax base goes up, the compensating rate goes down. In the whole formula to come up with, how much you pay tax.
If the value goes up.
Yeah, if the value goes up, the compensating rate goes down because the city can only collect a certain amount more than the year before.
Mhm.
So, like for example, One Highland is not in the tax base.
I know.
If One Highland was in the tax base, the compensating rate for everybody would have actually gone down more.
Exactly.
So, that's how it affects the taxpayer for town.
Exactly. Well, thank you. Except, I thank you for that. I don't understand the benefit for me, but thank you. I appreciate that.
And Sharon, I'll sit down with you later, get questions, and we'll get you answers.
I understood what he said.
And Sharon, there's a lot more to it.
I know there is. I do. Thank you so much. I do have another question. I have talked to a couple people about this. I'd like to know, when did the city decide to earmark $520,000 of the taxpayers' money to the Tower Park Athletic Complex? I must have missed that meeting because I do pay attention. Can you tell me when that was earmarked and when that was voted on?
We discussed that at the finance committee meeting.
I was there. I don't know when that was done. I mean, did you guys vote on that and I missed it?
I didn't look back on that. I know we discussed it. There was an ask from the Fort Thomas Independent Schools. It's obviously a project, well, maybe not obviously. It's not a project that's been bid out. It's not a project that's even gotten to the point where the district is even moving forward yet. But we wanted to include it in this budget for if it does come to fruition here in July.
Are you giving any of the Tower Park property to that project?
There'll be some either temporary land swaps, but most of it's gonna go back to the way it's gonna be. Because right now there's right of way that might be changed. So there will be some land swaps in the order to get the construction project done, but then the land will come back. At the end, it'll be the same amount of land as the.
Yeah, because I think if you're gonna take public property away, there should be a vote on it.
There's a we're talking a fraction
I know, but still. it's
of
a
property, because the majority of that property, including South Park, which we use, is
Yeah.
actually owned by the school.
Is the road staying from Sargent to Carmel Way Road?
We don't know yet. The road is going to be open. It may be reconstructed and come out on a different part of Carmel Manor Road. But it will be open from current plans.
Could I ask for some town hall meeting times before you guys move forward more with the residents back there and the whole community, so they have a better understanding?
We did a
about this?
town hall meeting.
Just one, and and you know how they got communicated? My sister-in-law, we had to print out flyers and walk around and hand them out, or nobody would have known about it, Matt. You understand what we're saying?
I
People
do.
aren't knowing
The
about
problem
it.
is it's a school project and I'm not.
I know, but it's our
controlling it.
money,
Right.
taxpayers' money, so that's what I'm asking, please. Okay,
I want to talk about that project real quick.
thank you, Adam.
No, I mean, thank me. You haven't heard me yet.
Oh, well, it doesn't matter, I appreciate you chiming in.
But
Thanks.
I want you to know how excited I am about this project.
Well, that's
We
good.
really hang our hats on the school system here. We have a unique situation here where we have a lot of crossovers with the tennis courts, the basketball, the Highland baseball park, and this field here. And it's imperative that we stay up with the times to give us the access to the properties we need and the system that they need to keep our athletic program alive and comparable with the other ones in the area. This is a $12 million plus project, and this is a very
It's
small
$12
piece.
million?
I think that's what it's gonna be, is what the estimate is, right? Roughly, something like that. The school's paying for it, but we're
And
gonna,
the taxpayers are paying for it?
well, everybody, taxpayers pay for everything. So, we got across the whole Commonwealth.
That's why I'm up here.
So, but for the city to give up this small amount of money, which seems large, But
It
for the
does.
overall project, it actually creates a better facility for us, and it's gonna be open to the public. They don't have to open it to the public, so this allows public access when the school's not using it, because it is a private piece of property. So this in addition gives us a place to train, bathrooms, safe environment for us to do. So I do think that I just want people to know publicly that I'm very in favor of this project, and I love the way we work with the school system. It's imperative to keep our schools
Well,
on top.
that's great, and I appreciate your input, but there's a whole 17,000 people that have input too, and that's all I'm asking for.
Sure.
That's it. Thank you. Appreciate it. I have another one. Let's see. This should be the last one, okay? The general promise statute, I'm seeing $125,000 marked for that. When was that voted on? Was that at the same meeting?
I believe that was last council, or was that the finance committee or last council meeting?
Yeah, it was the finance committee meeting, it was the same with the school project, there wasn't an actual vote taken, we just discussed both the athletic complex, the plan, which is not set in stone yet, and also the statute was one of the things we discussed. There's no vote, there's just simply a recommendation out of the finance committee, and so we met, discussed, and to kind of gauge the temperature of the council people, who were present and the community also, and then we decided as a group that let's include this in the budget. Now, the first hearing of the budget is tonight, so there hasn't been any votes on this, but that's why you're seeing.
Thank you. Okay, well, see, I was at the meeting and you can't have any community input, so I don't know how you got our input when we're sitting there quiet.
Well, I mean, the best we can do is talk with people who are in attendance, and then obviously there needs to be, we all agree, there needs to be better communication.
Thank you, and thank you, and when you get that outreach, you're gonna get the correct input if you do it correctly and get the independent person. That's what we're saying.
The survey was great, we can't do it without your input.
Exactly, and that's what we're asking for. And, let's see. That should do it. Thank you all.
Thank you.
You're awesome.
Would anyone else like to speak about the budget?
Peggy Maggio, 37 South Shaw Lane, Fort Thomas, Kentucky. Mayor Hush, you talked tonight about the roadmap being our community plan. I didn't know there was a community plan, and I have to tell you, nobody I'd ever spoken to in Fort Thomas knows that there's a community plan. But I first heard about it from Elisa W. Rogers way back in October of 2018 when she referred to it in making some zoning decisions. And as you all know, it's a 225-page document. The meetings happened in 2016 and 17. The document was written by CT Consultants in 2018. My question, Matt, to you is, I think statutorily we need to revise that again in 2023. What are your plans for community input for revision of the community plan this year, since it's on roadmap?
We have not discussed it with council with the plan. I mean, if the staff itself has discussed it, but we haven't discussed it as a council.
Will there be community input in the revision of the community plan? Thank you. The other thing I wanted to make this point in public is that I believe that parts of the 2018 community plan are invalid. I think there's conclusions in the community plan. I don't know what they were based on. For example, in the zoning portion of the community plan, I've been told, we have several people in the audience tonight who sat on that zoning committee of the community plan. And I've been told that potentially 7 to 8 citizens met with that committee as that went forward. It wasn't a huge representation of Fort Thomas citizens. Also, I've been told that a mock-up of One Highland was there at the second meeting of the community plan. So sometimes I think maybe the community plans can get written for projects that are already in progress rather than as a guidepost for future projects. For example, when it comes to zoning, when you look in the community plan, there was a community survey of 900 plus respondents. Of those respondents, 83% did not want new housing types. Of the 17% that did want new housing types, 56% wanted single-family homes. How we got from that to a dense downtown, which was the conclusion of the community plan, is beyond me. Again, I haven't spoken to one person who wants density or more density in our area here in the Central Business District. So my point tonight is just, as we go forward with the community plan, if we're going to use our guideposts for budgetary or other policy decisions, that we get an updated version, that we have community output that is widely communicated. I didn't know it was happening. People I know didn't know it was happening. So again, going back to the communication issue, if we let people know that we're going to have a revision, that they can have their voices heard, and that we can have conclusions made that adequately and accurately reflect what the people think. I would hope that's how we would go forward. Mayor Haas, I know that you're for transparency, so I would really appreciate that type of process here in 2023.
Great.
Thank you.
Next, I'll address on the budget.
My name is Dennis Montpelier, 40 Kathy Lane. I'm not as up to date as most of the people in the audience, but in listening to what was been discussed tonight, the sports complex that was discussed, I had heard a little bit about it, and I wasn't too sure what the amount of dollars were involved in it. My first question was, we're talking about the soccer complex, correct? Track.
Soccer and track.
Why are we changing that? Because it's just been resurfaced, what, 3 years ago with artificial turf?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. It's been over 10 years.
Over 10 years.
Was it new?
Yeah, it's exceeded, it's like,
It's a shame, we think things were done yesterday, like 20 years ago. We do that all the time.
But, okay, so I was told that they're gonna change the direction of the
that's
field.
what the school's looking at now, yes.
Okay, why is that being changed around? Because we're talking from
A lot of
major,
these,
major.
yeah, I mean, a lot of these questions need to go to the school district because it is their project. So for me, it's kind of hearsay for me to be explaining it. They went through a couple plans of turning it, and well, one plan of turning it and they've got various benefits. There's parking benefits, ADA accessibility. That's much easier doing it that way, just due to elevation changes and things. But
You'll see regional events, a lot of benefits.
yeah, I mean, they wanted to expand the track, they wanted to expand the actual space between the soccer field and the track, which right now is challenging for the game, which turning it sideways makes it wider, it gives more space for throw-ins, things like that. I'm not a soccer guy, but that's what they tell me. So, and again, it's their property, it's their project, so.
Well,
they're
it was
just asking-
with the city.
they're asking for, some financial
When
assistance.
the grant was originally done, it was the city and school in a partnership in order to get it from the feds in order to do that. I guess I was just kind of surprised, and my mistake as far as how long it's been since it's been resurfaced. I'm just trying to, in my mind, kind of figure out going the other way. I guess so you're really going into, and you're gonna start moving some major properties, roads, I guess, construction, because you're talking about
It's a small section of our road, yes.
right. Well, the other thing is, aside from that, there is another project of the playground in Tower Park. That's being redone or revised.
Yes.
Here again, I don't know any of the dollars, but just numbers being thrown out. Maybe it originally was 300,000. Now here it's like $1 million. And, the playground's great, and I think the city has done a fantastic job in all of our parks. I just was trying to comprehend if the $1 million is a valid number.
It's closer to 2.5 million for the full project.
What? I just can't comprehend that much money for that playground.
Yeah, it's all gonna be ADA accessibility, it's a very inclusive playground for multiple, children.
Was that the original project?
I wasn't here during it, this was all started before I got here, but I'm not sure what the original was. I'm sure it was a lot more than 300,000 though. We're talking playgrounds, they're
300,000
expensive.
might have been.
Yeah,
kind of like that.
playgrounds are
When I heard the million, I thought, that's a lot of money, 2.5 or whatever, that's.
That's the main playground in Fort Thomas. It's ones that's used 12 months out of the year. I mean, it's one of the biggest playgrounds and absolutely most used in town.
I think two things that shocked me the most when I got in government was the length of time it takes to get something done and sticker shock on how much things actually cost even back in the day to get things done, and we're just more transparent, I guess, with our numbers, or more people are more engaged, let's say, to know what things actually cost. But this is something that isn't new. You're just hearing it as you heard it for the first time, and it is there and it is real. And
Am I correct in saying that the project valuation has changed quite a bit since the initial? Or has it always been that much money?
I think it's been we don't know the exact numbers until we're done with the projects when we work on it. we work on a scale of what we like, I think. Jeff, you would have to,
It's always been around that same number. The only difference would be the increase from
COVID,
and.
which is significant.
Yeah.
You know, and then try to get it
I
up.
wouldn't say significant, but it's always been the $2 million plus project.
So it's always been about that value.
Even from back in 17 or 18, when we first started working through it, it's past due, its lifespan is past due. We went through many different options. We looked at like a cookie cutter that was pre-made, they all cost the same. It's crazy how much these things cost.
Yeah.
And they, per state statute, we really can't build it ourselves. So we have to get it through when it's approved. I'm pretty sure you get it through like an approved vendor that makes these safe playground equipment, and it's expensive.
Yeah, it's kind of like buying something for special needs, anything like that, the price is triple.
Is there a schedule as far as when this project is gonna start and be completed? I mean,
Yeah, we should start in October, November timeframe. Right now, yes, right now the contractor is getting ready to prepare the bids to be bid out to see the actual costs. We should have that in the next couple of months.
okay, so that 2.5 or whatever could go up.
It's an estimate.
All right, well, thank you very much.
All right, thank you. All right, any other comments about the budget? If not, whoops, sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, Melanie Powers from 13 Pearson. I just wanted to support Sharon McKnight's statement requesting more community feedback for the sports complex. I think the scope of it, I went by the way to the meeting, paid a lot of attention. I think the scope of it is huge, certainly much larger than myself or anyone else was aware of. So way too big for that one meeting, which was not as informative as I think most people who were there wanted it to be. A comment that I heard from a gentleman behind me was, it was a great sales job, but I didn't learn much. I would agree with that statement. The other thing that happened I was particularly dismayed about was in the question and answer part after the presentation, which I was very much looking forward to, did not happen as I experienced in any public meeting of that kind, which was that we were divided into 3 groups. A woman stood up and asked that that not happen. She said that she was there because she really wanted to hear everyone else's question and comments and then answers from the school board. I certainly agreed with that. The person who was leading the presentation said, well, if you're from Sargent, because she mentioned she was from the area, that they could go over to, and he pointed to one section. And of course, the vast majority of people went to that section. And in fact, when I went to, excuse me, one of the other 2 corners of the mess hall, I was the only person there at that corner. That was fine. And very nice gentleman, I don't recall his name, listened very intently to my questions, but he admitted he could not answer any of them. My concerns were about environmental impact. One of the things that was really sold during the description of the sports complex was how it was going to be a regional draw. And I understand that and the advantages of it, of course, but I asked him, well, as someone who lives in Tower Park, you know, what's that going to do to the traffic through? Because I did raise a soccer star. I drove all over the state of California pretty much every weekend I wasn't working, and I know how big those kind of regional competitions and et cetera, all the games that soccer people participate in can be. Multiple ones throughout a whole day, it's quite a lot. And he said he didn't know, and he doesn't think that that was even a focus. So that didn't get addressed. Also environmental in terms of the animals who live in Tower Park, and there are a lot of non-humans in Tower Park. Again, you have the asphalt there, the traffic, the lights, the noise. That all plays in on the animals that live there, as well as Tower Park being on one of the primary migratory bird routes east of the Mississippi River 2 times a year. So I'm not saying that this could not happen and that I'm against it unilaterally, because I'm not. However, I do think we need to address some very specific issues about it, and that one meeting was not enough. And lastly, as Sharon mentioned, given this scope and how it would be a huge impact on what I see as the jewel of Fort Thomas, a historic park, and I'd like to see more history and nature emphasized rather than sports, as great as they are. I think we have some questions that need to be addressed about that. And I think, as Sharon said, we need more communication, conversation between the public and the school board and who's ever designing this complex, looking at alternatives to the asphalt parking lot, for instance, because there are some alternatives. And especially since we are partially funding it and doing some land swaps. So I agree with Sharon, and I sincerely hope that we can get questions answered about it, because as of now, my questions aren't being answered. I know there are other people who have similar questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak about the budget? Okay, if not, we have 2 other public hearings for liquor license. Joe, if you will handle those, please.
Yes, I will. I had my microphone back there, but I figured I'll a little more official that way. Okay, first one this evening, we have a hearing for Tickle Pickle Restaurant. Application has been received from Tickle Pickle Fort Thomas LLC, doing business as Tickle Pickle Restaurant at 915 North Fort Thomas Avenue, Fort Thomas, Kentucky 41075, for an NQ2 restaurant, retail drink, and a special Sunday sales license. The owner of that property is Carrie Owens, 6888 Mile in Cincinnati, Ohio. This application has been on file for a few weeks in my office, and I have not received any comment as far as any of the applications have gone. Is there any comment from the audience on this one?
I don't have it.
Very good.
Is that the same license that the 915 had?
Actually, it is a restaurant-specific license. The 915 actually operated on a quota retail drink license, which was specifically more of a bar license. There's a food sale component in the NQ2 license, so this one's actually a little more restrictive. It's more of a restaurant license than a bar license.
But they still get alcohol as well as beer, as well
Yes,
as wine,
that's right.
as well as.
Yeah,
It's full service.
Yeah, the types of alcohol that can be sold are exactly the same.
Thank you.
All right. So with no comment on that, I will go ahead and close that one. Next one we have. Application has been received from Melissa Beagle, doing business as Highland Square Cafe, 654 Highland Avenue, Suite 1, Fort Thomas, Kentucky 41075, for an NQ4 retail malt beverage drink license and quota retail drink license, as well as a special Sunday sales license. Owner of that property is Highland Avenue Partners LLC at 42 Indiana Avenue here in town. This application actually came in shortly after Tickle Pickle's application. It's been in my office for a couple of weeks. I've yet to receive any comment on this one either. Is there any comment, question from the crowd on this one? This one's actually the former Galveston. So,
I guess I have the same question. What does that allow? Like, I don't know what the.
same.
Is it full alcohol? No,
Yes.
I mean, like, it's a.
This one doesn't. This one doesn't. Yeah, this is a full alcohol license. The quota retail drink is specifically a distilled spirits license, which allows you to sell distilled spirits in addition to beer. All right. Having no comment on this one, I will go ahead and close this one. What time do you have?
7:30.
At 7:30. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Joe. We are closing closing all the public hearings, and now we are officially starting the council meeting. And we'll start with the good old pledge of the flag, please.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Melissa, could you do the roll call, please?
Mr. Locke?
Here.
Mr. Henry?
Here.
Mrs. McIntosh? Here. Mr. Ellison?
Here.
Mr. Diesel?
Here.
Mr. Schweitzer?
Okay, I'll entertain a motion for approval of the minutes of the May 15th meeting. Second? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, now we're down to reports of boards, committees, and commission, and this is a time for discussion with planning commission. So planning commission members, come up and
Mayor House,
sign
do
in.
you think it would be prudent if we skipped down to ordinance and resolutions? I see Derek back here, so he doesn't have to sit here if he's gonna say anything, or at least anyone. I'm just saying,
You okay with that?
that way he doesn't have to sit through that whole.
That's
That's
fine with
okay
me.
with everybody.
Would you like to get out of here and not have to stay?
Well, I'd love to stay, but I promised my boy I'd see playing.
All right.
Come on your feet, you gotta think a little bit.
I always use my wife as an excuse. I never thought about using kids, it's very good.
Yeah, I told him I'd be back
Okay,
in
down
one.
to.
Hey, Adam, are you making an official motion to change the agenda? Wow.
Oh, yeah, is that okay? Is that how you have to do it? Yes, I'm sorry, I apologize.
It'd be better for us to have council vote to change the.
Yeah, I'm making a motion to change the agenda to go through the ordinance and resolution orders prior to the meeting.
All of them?
And it's gonna second.
Well, they just get read and go, they don't take.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Now, we're gonna go down to municipal order MO08 2023.
A municipal order appointing Derek Durbin as alternate member of the Fort Thomas Board of Ethics for a one-year term.
Is there a motion?
I'll make a motion. Approve. Second.
Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Locke?
Aye.
Mr. Henry?
Aye.
Mrs. McIntosh? Mr. Ellison?
Aye.
Mr. Diesel?
Aye.
Mr. Strange?
Very good.
All right, thank you so much.
Did you want to say
Thank you
anything?
very much. Thank you. Volunteering.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Give us that one. Yeah, that was a motion, because.
Just to introduce myself, my name is Derek Durbin. I'm at 1044 North Avenue. I'm married to Denise Trout Durbin. We have two small children, both in the Fort Thomas School District. And I'm an attorney. I've been an attorney for 20 years, worked mostly with youth in that capacity, either representing them as a public defender or prosecuting parents who abuse or neglected children. Currently, I serve as what is considered a hearing officer over in Hamilton County, so I hear administrative appeals. I take evidence and I determine what the facts are, and then I apply those facts to the law. And so my job and my profession is being a neutral arbiter, and I look forward to being welcome for this committee. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Derek.
All right, back up to the agenda. Planning folks, come on up, find your seat, and
Thank you for making that change.
take it away.
Derek, y'all give me a minute, I will load up the presentation. evening. Can y'all hear me?
No.
How about now?
Yes.
Okay. Sam, if you'll do me a favor and raise your arm if you can start fading. Thank you. Good evening. I am Elisa W. Rogers with CT Consultants. Here with me is Frank Tweed, who's also with CT. Thank you so much for having us here this evening to discuss the Central Business District with both the City Council and the Planning Commission. Tonight, we will briefly review the zoning ordinance update process and where we are in that process, discuss the community engagement sessions that we have been having since January. I will also briefly mention a goal for tonight's meeting. We will briefly review the zoning regulation, what zoning regulations can actually do, and then set the stage for our discussions about the Central Business District, which includes both downtown and Midway, by reviewing maps of the Central Business District and some existing zoning regulations. We will discuss in detail specific issues related to future development and redevelopment in the Central Business District. And then if we have time, we'll briefly discuss some noteworthy topics that are currently being discussed by the Planning Commission throughout the zoning ordinance update. And then we will end with next steps. As most of y'all know, I view these presentations as a discussion with both the Planning Commission and the City Council. Please feel free to interrupt, ask questions, or add to the conversation in any way. In other words, don't let me drone on if there's something you want to say. The zoning ordinance update process is progressing in roughly 4 phases. The first phase was an analysis of the existing conditions, both in terms of the city's built environment, but also a thorough examination of the existing zoning and subdivision ordinances. And at the end of that phase, we produced a diagnostic report with our findings and recommendations, and that is still available on the city's website. In phase 2, which we commenced in March of 2022, we began the process of creating the revised regulations, and the major changes from your current code are being fleshed out, and we are currently in phase 2. In phase 3, we will revise the phase 2 drafts as we're directed to do so, discuss any outstanding policy items, and produce a new complete draft of the updated zoning ordinance. We will also align the zoning map with the new zoning districts. And then phase 4 is adoption. The schedule for this zoning ordinance update has changed because additional districts have been added and detailed discussions are taking place in front of the Planning Commission. When we met last December, we talked about potentially having this done, like late fall or early into maybe next year, January of next year. We are currently behind that schedule, as this indicates, and we are currently reviewing the last article of the update, which are all the regulations applicable to districts, and we hope to conclude this phase by February. Since January, we've been holding open office hours at Fort Thomas Coffee. These engagement sessions are held the Thursday after the Planning Commission meeting. Initially, the sessions were held on Thursday morning, but an evening session was added starting in February. The sessions are designed to allow community members to just drop in, ask questions, and have conversations, and provide comments on what they heard at the Planning Commission the night before. And then also to provide any comments they may have about the zoning ordinance update in general, really in a very informal atmosphere. We average about 10 to 12 or so attendees across the 2 sessions. And these coffee and conversation sessions have given me an opportunity to hear what many community members have to say about their concerns. It's given me the opportunity to also have conversations about what community members really value about their community. In general, they've been a very worthwhile endeavor. So why are we all here this evening? Our goal really is to facilitate a collaboration between the council and the Planning Commission on a platform for downtown and Midway. We may not make any definitive decisions tonight, but we may. If not, we have started the conversation and we are likely to discover other avenues to discuss and may find some common ground. Back in December, we talked about exactly what zoning can do, what can be regulated using zoning tools. At that time, I mentioned that zoning is a blunt tool, both because of the limitations placed on it by the state and federal government, but also because we can only fine-tune the standards so much. Generally, we can regulate use and lot characteristics. We can dictate where a building must go on a lot using regulations for minimum and maximum front setbacks. We can even regulate how a facade looks to a certain degree by mandating a certain amount of transparency or windows. We can require that long buildings have vertical divisions and set a maximum building length. There are things we can do, but it is the interplay of all of these regulations that create a place that is defined by the public realm. These zoning regulations create the public realm that our community members experience when they stroll down the streets in downtown Midway. What I'm trying to say in a really long-winded way is the conversation that we're going to have tonight creates a place. And even though we're going to be talking about finite numbers, never, ever forget that. Okay, how long has Sam been yelling at me?
I just recently just put it up.
Okay.
So if you could just bend it a little closer for you.
All right, we'll try again. So as I was saying, we have to have an understanding that the relationship of all of these zoning standards are really just not parts and pieces, but all of these parts and pieces create that public realm. They experience the public space. They create the street life that exists within your right-of-ways. And it is the place where public life happens. Again, these are important things. The public realm is comprised of more than just individual buildings. It is how these individual buildings are all knitted into a fabric that creates a sense of place that is unique to Fort Thomas, whether we're talking about downtown or Midway. When taken together, these individual buildings, together with the improvements in the right-of-way, meaning the streets and the street trees and all of those things, create the public realm. And paying special attention to how buildings interface with the public right-of-way creates a public ground that community members want to spend time in. They want to explore instead of just coming to their ultimate destination and leaving. We have to think very carefully about the relationship of all of these elements and not just think about the siting of individual buildings. The public realm in downtown and Midway is really and truly an outdoor room that is formed with the edges of the buildings. And in order for people to stroll that outdoor room and to visit and to linger, we have to activate the public realm. We have to activate that street. Activation can happen for a number of different ways and for a number of different reasons, but one way is to allow a view into buildings to really and truly transform that street wall so there's an interaction between the people who are walking down the sidewalk and the people who are inside those buildings. Remember, people are essentially lazy, and there has to be a reason for them to keep moving from place to place. And we're going to create that by creating standards that work for that activation. So, I would like to set the stage for our discussion in the Central Business District by providing some background information. In the current zoning ordinance, there are two areas of the city that are zoned the Central Business District. The downtown or town center, as it's sometimes referred to in some of your city documents. I'm just going to be honest with you that I typically refer to that area called town center as downtown. So in terms of nomenclature, when I say downtown, this is what I mean. In downtown, the Central Business District goes from Forest Avenue on the north side and then down to Montville Court on the southern end. And then the district extends down Lumley Avenue, Miller Lane, and Audubon Place. In Midway, the Central Business Zoning District designation is shown in the army green on the map and includes the parcels that are fronting on South Fort Thomas Avenue, beginning south of the Cincinnati Bell Building, and then it extends to one lot south of Brentwood Place. The district also includes lots on River Road, on Garrison, on Shawnee, on Southview, and Grandview. Local historic districts were formed for downtown and Midway in the General Code of Ordinances in 2002. While these local historic districts were formed outside of the zoning ordinance, they do reference the Central Business Zoning District. In 2002, the Design Review Board was set up, as well as the design guidelines were adopted. Consequently, anytime you have exterior alterations to buildings in the Central Business District, be it downtown or Midway, which are visible from the public right-of-way, they must be reviewed in terms of compliance with the adopted design guidelines, and a certificate of appropriateness must be issued when required. Today, there are minimal development standards in the central business district. The standards set a minimum lot area, a minimum lot width, and a maximum height. The setback standards are left to the discretion of the planning commission. And that's probably happened to deal with all the differences that happen between downtown and Midway, and then all the different contexts within downtown and Midway. On the screen, you will see a list of permitted uses in the central business district, not the conditional ones. These uses, while a really small type up there, are basically your typical retail, office, and service uses. Paying particular attention to what's highlighted, which is residential, because we'll be having a conversation about that later on. So despite there being obvious differences between downtown and Midway, there's only one zoning district governing both areas. Essentially, it is one size fits all. There is no difference in development standards or uses from Midway and downtown. Even though there's an incredible amount of marked differences in the built environment in both places. And there are no sub-districts. A sub-district can be used to modify development standards or uses within an overall zoning district. Sub-districts allow zoning districts to be fine-tuned for a district while supporting the overall purpose of the district. To enhance these areas, more granular standards are probably needed. So I'm going to stop here and see if you have any comments or questions before we move into the meat of the discussion about the regulations that currently exist for both downtown and Midway. Okay, let's keep going. So to facilitate tonight's discussion, I have broken down the discussion topics into 3 main areas. To some degree, this breakdown really is artificial because the topics overlap. We will discuss the Midway and downtown separately. To open the conversation, we will start with the development standards that help to create place or the character of both the downtown and Midway. These are the regulations, as I said, for setbacks and building heights and standards that regulate the look and feel of buildings and facades. And these are objective standards. They are numbers. We will move on to use considerations, and I have chosen certain use issues to discuss. There are many more, but there are just 2 that we'll be discussing this evening, and those are predominantly the residential uses on the first floor and the existing dwellings that exist in both downtown and Midway. And finally, we will discuss the central business district in terms of the boundaries. We have discussed many times in these coffee and conversation sessions the boundaries of the central business district, and that's why that topic is also on the agenda for this evening. And then we'll close these discussions, giving y'all an opportunity to just say anything else you want to say about downtown and Midway. So we're going to start with the character considerations, meaning the building form and placement in downtown. So again, we're starting with downtown. As I said, we're going to bifurcate the discussion and talk about downtown and Midway separately. As we begin the discussion, let's think about your homework. I asked Kevin to tell you all to go out and look at downtown, to think about what the defining characteristics of downtown are, what you value in the built environment, and what should change. So I hope you all did your homework. That's what's expected before you come to the meeting. And remember that the development standards are a key component of creating place and creating a downtown, as we're about to start that discussion, that you want to experience. So I'm going to do a very quick photo tour of downtown. We will start with the west side of the street. And I apologize, these photos aren't to scale. They should give you a feeling of building placement on the lots. Some of these photos are mine, others are screenshots. In one case, Frank took a couple photographs for me. But please forgive any bad photography. As we move through the photos, think about the building placement on the lot, how buildings relate to the public realm, how they relate to each other, and think about scale. Again, hopefully your homework comes into play and you've walked these streets recently. As I understand it, Highland Avenue and North Fort Thomas, that intersection is your historic center of downtown. And on this side of the street, we have a traditional Main Street buildings that are 2 stories right at the sidewalk. Across Highland, we come to One Highland Plaza. Both the traditional buildings and One Highland have very little setback from the sidewalk except for the outdoor dining at One Highland, which is used to mark that corner. Building placement on the lot changes when we progress to the former bank next to One Highland and move toward the Masonic Lodge. Both of these buildings are set back more than 30 feet from the front property line. Notice that I use the term property line and not setback, and not sidewalk. So when we're talking about front setback, we're talking about the dimension from the right-of-way line to the front of the building, and because the right-of-way changes in terms of its width as we move through downtown, your perceptions may be somewhat off. Later on, we can, as we write these standards, deal with that, but right now, when I talk about setback, I'm talking about the distance from the front of the building to the front property line. As we head toward Forest Avenue, there are 6 structures that were originally built as single-family detached dwellings until we get to the Fifth Third Bank. Some of these homes are used as homes, others of them are used as offices with residential uses on the upper floors. The homes are all set back from Fort Thomas Avenue and have side setbacks, meaning there's separations between all of those homes. But in general, there's about 14 feet to sort of give you a sense of what that dimension of side setback is. The front setback varies partially because Fort Thomas Avenue at that point takes a turn, and the front setback varies from approximately 15 to 45 feet. The line of homes is interrupted by the Fifth Third Bank, which has a generous front setback of about 75 feet due to that front yard parking. The dwellings used for business purposes resume on the other side of the Fifth Third Bank, and the central business district ends with Forest Avenue. Because the homes and Fifth Third Bank set back from North Fort Thomas and are separated from each other, you have a very different feeling when you walk versus the commercial structures that are closer to the sidewalk at the intersection of Highland and North Fort Thomas. And ask yourself, should that different feeling and different sense of place remain as we're starting to write and think about these standards? The two-story, just to give you a frame of reference, the two-story house next to Fifth Third Bank is set back approximately 53 feet. And then 155, which is that large home next to Fifth Third, is set back 75 feet. We now move to the east side of North Fort Thomas Avenue, and the CBD starts at Montville, which is where the post office is located. After the post office, you have 2 banks with drive-throughs, both of which have a front setback of about 40 feet. Where Highland Avenue terminates with North Fort Thomas, you have what is called a terminated vista. And that terminated vista at Highland includes a bank, when we started this conversation, we started briefly speaking about the public realm and the importance it plays in creating a sense of place. Where Highland Avenue intersects with North Fort Thomas, as I said, is that terminated vista. And to give you a definition, a terminated vista is a building or monument that stands at the end or in the middle of the road so that when you look up the street, the view ends with that site. Terminating vistas are an important method of adding aesthetic appeal and a sense of place to a city, as well as a sense of arrival and destination. So think about what that would look like if it terminated into something besides the bank's drive-through. So as you will notice as we're moving through this, we're having also a civics lesson on urban design. As we move northward from the Village of Players, we encounter the more older traditional Main Street buildings, which includes the old theater. All of these buildings are right at the sidewalk, forming what's called a street wall. The street wall continues with the building housing Fort Thomas Drugs and the school building. Unfortunately, the active engagement between folks on the sidewalk and the buildings that form the street wall ends with the school building. There's a dead spot that's created because there are no transparent windows really on the Fort Thomas Independent Schools as it faces North Fort Thomas Avenue, and then there's also a parking lot. Across Miller Lane is the bank, but ask yourself this question, what's going to draw you across that street? Unfortunately, the bank really doesn't have any active engagement due to the nature of its windows, and then the pedestrians are walking encounters a drive-through. Down Miller Lane, there's a strip commercial center, and then which also sits back from the street with a parking lot. And then across Lumley, the storefronts continue to be right at the sidewalk. But notice the top photo, at some point in the past, these storefronts were added to houses. They were never actually a commercial building, they were just added on the front of those single-family homes. And then the downtown building, the downtown ends with the city building. The city building is set back from the street, and the street wall is broken as a result. However, the new landscaping and opening up the front plaza make the building much more inviting and welcoming and provides more active engagement with the street. Prior to the renovation, the city building really was closed off and removed from Fort Thomas Avenue. So as you've seen from this discussion, today downtown has two distinct characters for its built environment. The west side, excluding One Highland and the Warren and the Travel buildings, is composed of individual buildings with both side and front setbacks. The east side of the street, for the most part, has a defined street wall with buildings at the sidewalk. So we come to the first question to ponder about the future of downtown. Should the development standards be the same in all portions of downtown? In other words, should we think about something besides one size fits all for downtown? Should we have something like a sub-district? These sub-districts, as I said, can contribute to a cohesive downtown, but recognize the differences in the built environment. That, again, is assuming that you want to continue that difference that exists today north of One Highland. At the conversation and coffee sessions that we've been having, we've heard from community members that the less intense development is desired on the west side of Fort Thomas Avenue from One Highland up to Forest Avenue.
Could you repeat that? What now?
So at our coffee and conversation meetings, what I've heard from some community members is that less intense development is desired from One Highland all the way up to Forest Avenue, up on that side of the street.
Where the kind of residential houses are in between the Fifth Third, yeah.
So if it meets with your approval, height and setback standards could be differentiated using sub-districts to only concentrate density and intensity where it's desired in downtown. One possible approach is the sub-district that I mentioned. It could be called something like the Central Business District Downtown Core. One possible location would be what's shown in purple on the screen. And this sub-district recognizes the traditional shorefront portion of downtown and the existing 50-foot maximum height would be retained potentially, as well as definitive setback standards incorporated into the zoning ordinance. I mentioned when we started this discussion that right now there aren't definitive setbacks, but given that we're creating a sub-district, we could do that if we chose to do that. I would also recommend including development standards to reduce the perceived mass of long buildings and to create active building edges. And those are types of standards that could also be incorporated into zoning ordinance. Should, for example, the banks develop over time. Today, it is much less likely that you are going to get smaller individual buildings constructed in downtown than you had in the past. However, the longer buildings that tend to be more financially feasible can be broken down by including standards like maximum building width and also requiring vertical divisions of the buildings. And we can also do things like requiring really lots of different entrances and anything that would give the impression that the person who's walking down the street is encountering different storefronts as opposed to one long mass of a building. So the picture you see here is a community in Ohio where that's been done.
In Ohio.
Do you know where it is in Ohio?
Yes, it's New Albany.
New Albany.
As I repeatedly mentioned as we went through the photo tour, building location is not enough to activate the street and create a pleasurable experience for strollers. In other words, walkability requires additional design elements, so I would also recommend including facade standards, such as mandating a minimum level of transparency, and then also, as I said, frequent building entrances.
And so this is all new construction here that's just kind of made to look in New Albany, that street that you just showed.
Yes, ma'am.
It's all new construction.
So outside of the Central Business District downtown core, the maximum building height could be reduced to something like 40 feet if y'all chose to do so. To do that, the front setback, the sidewalk could also be increased to have a minimum and a maximum setback. For example, a minimum of 25 and a maximum of 35. And then this way you would ensure where the building goes on the lot by including both a minimum and a maximum. And then also requiring the side setback would ensure that you have the separation between buildings. So this slide and the next one show this type of development. In other words, where you have the separation between buildings and a little bit of a setback. And in this particular example, those exact same standards are used for these buildings, and it's located across the street from a more intense small town downtown. So this gives you an idea of what it could potentially look like to have commercial buildings with a little bit of setback and some separation. And here's another photo showing that as well. Okay, so I've droned on for a long time. So it's time for you to stop and think about your homework and some of the topics that we've talked about. So for example, should there be some different districts with different standards in downtown? Should we have uniform standards in downtown? What should happen in terms of building form and placement? So I'm gonna stop here and open it up to y'all.
I just want to say something. I was thinking about this today. I just want to thank you and Matt, especially you, Lisa, right? I always say Lisa. Lisa, is that right? The feedback I get from the community on what you're doing at Fort Thomas Coffee is always impressive. They enjoy speaking with you. They compliment you every chance they get about those meetings. You and Matt to set it up and get engaged. It's been wonderful. My time with you over the time has been invaluable for you to break it down, because this is not what I do. So I just want you to know that you guys did a great job with this, and that you have been getting a lot of compliments, and actually thank you, like Joan is there constantly, and Peggy, and a lot of the communities there, making sure they do constantly speak highly of you, so I want to thank you for that. It's been pretty nice to hear. We don't always hear that stuff.
And we thank her every time we walk in and say thank you, and we leave and say thank you. They're invaluable, and it's really, it's kind of sad that there's always several people. It's never just one or two people. There's always 6, 7, something like that. It'd be lovely if we beg for communication. There's so much at those meetings, so much more than the night before. For one thing, the night before you have 120 pages to go through in an hour, and the next day it's more conversational, which is, I think, beneficial.
You guys.
About this here, so I have a question. So I have some concerns. I love the idea of the mold that we have. You know what I mean? It seems like a great concept, but what we've done, is it working? I mean, our ROI on One Highland and the amount of money the city has invested in this, I feel that if we were to change this and for people to be developed, they would want more tax dollars, because we've given so much up already for this, for One Highland. I mean, I don't know how many units have sold, but I think 2 units have sold. So this change comes at a cost, and how long will it last? So I do have those concerns with that kind of investment in this. I have been thinking a lot about the houses on the other side of Fifth Third, so between Fifth Third and the Masonic Lodge, right there.
Yes.
And it looks like you've taken those out. Those are right? Is that correct?
Right, the idea in front of you is that you would still have a central business district with the same boundaries. You would just have sub-districts within them, if you chose to do that, so that you didn't have one size fits all. That we could start thinking about concentrating, if you chose to do so, density and development in the area that you see in purple, which is essentially those traditional storefronts as well as One Highland. And then outside of what's purple would be a different sub-district that would have building separations and front setbacks to respect what's there now. But again, that's a huge change, because right now you could replicate One Highland from there to Forest, for example.
With reference to, now I've been thinking about this, and I don't know if there's ever been any discussion on tax abatements for those business with the rentals on top. If there's been any discussion on this at all, to allow tax abatements to help them turn those 2 families back into 1 families, or because obviously it's a big cost. So now along in like 5, 7 years, has that ever been discussed with anybody?
I don't know if that's really zoning or the update that we're looking at. I mean, that's something we can.
Well, we're talking about this area, right? You're talking about ways to
We're talking
improve
about,
it.
yeah, we're talking about long-term, how do we want this area to look?
Well, that would be part of it, right, if we want to keep them.
That's what she's talking about. That those, so the section, correct me whenever I'm off here, the section that's not in purple, which will be those houses, that we have a different setback to keep that setback. As opposed to what's in purple. What's in purple, the setbacks is pretty much right on the road, right on the property line. It can be. So that's what she's talking about.
Yeah, and I see what you're saying about the tax.
So that's why she's saying to set. Do we want to
understand
have
what you're saying.
no setbacks for the whole area, or do we want to break?
Okay, I did that. I've been wanting to spitball that for a while. I'm just trying to save some of those homes. You know what I mean? We have too many businesses. This mold, this worries me a little bit, just because we're not like Bellevue, we're not through city. You know what I mean? So, people like to walk, but how much they like to shop. You know what I mean? And it's just something that would concern me with redesigning.
Well, I think if she did the zoning, that part of it, if she did the zoning a little different, I think that would protect the houses a little more. That maybe somebody would decide to do residential.
I was just gonna say, I think you're talking about, I understand what you're saying, but I think you're talking about two separate things, where the tax abatement is really a council policy decision.
Sure.
From the budgeting perspective, whereas from the zoning perspective, we can't control whether you do tax abatements or not.
I know, but it's also part of.
I understand.
You know what I mean? It's kind of. This is such a different environment, so I apologize if I get off subject. You know what I mean? I'm still.
No, I think it's a valid point, honestly. But like I said, that's a larger policy decision for you all, not necessarily under our code.
So is it zoned CBD right now for the houses that are not shaded in purple? Is that more about the replacement of the property? If something were to need to, if the house were to, God forbid, burn down, to rebuild that, as it sits now, it has to fall into the current guidelines, not. It has to fall into the current CBD guidelines.
Correct, and as I said, the setback standards are not definitive within the central business district. The only thing that's definitive is the maximum height. So potentially, you could have buildings at the sidewalk, you could have what's there. There's no guidance given within the zoning ordinance. And so what this does is codify the guidance. If you, and no matter what you choose in terms of your physical environment, whether you want something that's more intense from Montville all the way to Forest, or whether you want the sub-districts that we're talking about now, my recommendation would be that you put some definitive standards in there, so that a better understanding of what it is you desire, what your vision is. But yes, so right now what we're talking about is, for example, if something happened, what should go there? Should it look like One Highland, or should it look like, in terms of the lot placement, those homes that are there?
So we have an opportunity with subcategories to keep the houses, or have separation to where you can't have one move forward in hopes that sometime down the road that the same person that owns this can buy this, tear it down, and move it forward as well. So
correct.
If we label those in the CBD, or I don't know if you can remove them in the CBD, but or subcategorize the shaded versus non-shaded, and obviously you can't change the shaded part because they're all in the street. But the house, protect the integrity of the spacing there, and that's what you're asking for.
Yes, sir. That's it.
Recommending.
I agree with having the sub-districts. Is there any way that we could, it seems to me that there's like when we did the branding, they were pretty extensive in surveying people. And one of the most common things that the city heard was that it's amazing as it is. So is there a way to, like I saw earlier, right now the code says that you can be 4 stories and 50 feet. So could we make that 3 stories and 40 feet? You just lower to where you can keep those standards, or keep the sub-districts, but have it to where you're not, cause like I was driving by One Highland, and I know, so the top of the roof is 50 feet, is that correct?
Correct. You measure height from grade to the top.
Yeah, so the roof itself is probably 10 feet. So the gutter is probably 40 feet.
Could be.
So where they could, right now, build a 50-foot tall building with a flat roof, and it would look a lot taller than One Highland.
And that's what the zone says now, where we could scale that back to prevent that from happening.
Sure, you could, in the sub-district that is not colored purple, for example, you could have a mandated setback, both front and side, and you could decrease the height to about 40 feet. If that's the number you like. So to give you a frame of reference for what 40 feet looks like roughly, think about the 3-story building that is next door to the tower building in Midway. That building from grade to the top is 40 feet.
I'm sorry.
So the,
There's a lot of it.
okay.
With the, turret.
Yeah, so this, I got a picture. So the building that is, yeah, the pub. This pub, the building, I can't see my cursor. Yeah, so, the pub building
Alright,
is 40 feet.
the pub is 40 feet and it's 3 stories with a flat roof.
Approximately.
Approximately 40 feet, yeah.
The pub's in the middle there.
And keep in mind, the reason that happened is because ceiling heights were dramatically different when these buildings were built. Now there's a desire to have a taller first floor, and that's why I have a 3-story building that's 50 feet versus a 3-story building that is 40 feet. That's the difference.
But your recommendation of subdividing CBD is so we can have more control over what happens in the certain subdivides?
Yes, and we can set, reduced heights and setbacks and that kind of thing.
And that's
what we're
just
doing.
removing the cookie cutter approach to have it more uniform and more control from the board and the city.
Right.
It's not a one size fits all.
It's much more granular, much more tailored. One of the things we've heard throughout this whole process is, as Councilmember just said, people like the community the way it is. And you have a code that was really adopted without that kind of an approach. So part of the goal of this project is really to tailor to your built environment. And so that's what this would do. If you decide, but again, that's a fundamental policy choice. Do you want to have intensity like Wood Highland from stem to stern? Or do you want to have your current built environment?
So these are putting more restrictions basically on those areas.
Yes, sir.
And tightening it up to make sure that it suits the environment versus oversized, basically.
Basically, yes, sir.
What is, I see behind the Ameristop here, where the Ameristop is, I see how the purple cuts in the parking lot, it's open, why is that not in purple? Just curious, where, just the bank building and basically that front little, where the clock tower is.
So keep in mind, this is just a back of the envelope kind of approach. And we can fine tune it as we move forward, but that's just what a property line is.
Okay, two different properties, whatever.
And at some point, we'll have to decide what the future of Mineral is right there.
Does this project, do we move that CBD line? The group feels necessary to move that line?
You could, and we're actually gonna talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But yeah, for 2 particular examples, but yes, you could at this point in time change the boundary line. I tried to do a little bit of research and figure out when these boundaries were established and didn't have a whole lot of luck. I can tell you that they've been around since I can definitively say since about 1999. But what happened, I suspect they existed well before that.
It was one of the last. The last time we had a consultant come in to do this process was in 98, 99. And that's when they established the CB zoning district at that time.
Do you think the thought was to maybe expand some businesses, or why would they do
So,
some houses?
so just a little bit of background on the CBD. So part of the intent was at the time, that's when Fort Thomas was considering joining the Kentucky Renaissance Program, Main Street Program. And also at that same time, St. Louis was suffering some financial difficulties. When it was St. Louis, not St. Louis. And as you may know, City of Fort Thomas, getting back to the budget discussion to some degree, relies pretty heavily on real estate taxes. We don't have a highly developed commercial tax base. And there was significant concern at the time that if St. Louis went away completely or substantially, that the city's occupancy licensing tax revenues would significantly decrease. So we're looking at some flexibility to allow for commercial redevelopment where we had at least the bones of commercial redevelopment, bones of commercial districts. So that was part of the impetus at the time to densify both Midway and here, just to allow for some additional tax revenues from a commercial standpoint. The other flip side of it was, though, prior to when it was done, at the end of the 90s, early 2000s, was there was a 50-foot setback for all of the CBD, and it didn't allow multiple stories because it was based on the Northern Kentucky Area Planning Commission model zoning ordinance, which was created in the 60s for like Florence, was a national standard. So it was never tailored to Fort Thomas. So back in the 90s, the effort was to essentially, where we are today with the CBD, is essentially make no restrictions and allow the flexibility to judge it on a case-by-case basis. But we didn't want any more Fifth Thirds or US banks with a drive-through in a single-story bank building. So the intent was to allow for a multi-story building, less of a setback, could have residential on the upper levels, maybe not, but it could have, it just provided flexibility so that the Planning Commission moving forward could have basically the flexibility to look at a development on a case-by-case basis. And, 20 years later, you have one island, and you can judge it on its merits one way or the other. But, the way that the ordinance was set up essentially worked in that case to allow it to come to council, come to the commission, and make a decision on a case-by-case basis. So that's kind of the background of the law. And so now we're kind of retrenching a little bit and trying to put some restrictions on it, so maybe you don't have one Highlands potentially, but at the same time, what's going to happen to the Fifth Third, what's going to happen to the U.S. banks, they're not going to last forever, especially in today's post-COVID environment. So they're going to change at some point. It's just, what are they going to be in the future?
And we're not gonna box ourselves into a restriction by this type of, because I was thinking about that, 'cause that's what I was thinking about. Especially when we have our transition or whatever she said, whatever Lisa said. What's it called? The line of sight when you're coming up the hill and you
Oh, the
see-
tornado vista.
Yeah, that thing. So if there's an opportunity there, that might be nice. And I've actually like to go away. The statue of Andy Elsa there.
Also, the benefit here is to, when you sub-district the area, obviously you tailor it to the current built environment, then you can have, some, sort of what's the one that's new development. What's the downside to, is there anything that, from we would consider that it opens up some other area of concern? It doesn't seem like it's me, but.
So this, you'll hear me say this a lot, this is a huge policy choice. So the only, and I won't call it a downside, I will just say what you could potentially give up is more intense development. Now, keep in mind, as I talked about, that you do have local historic districts here, and it would have to go, all of those were mowed down, would have to go in front of the design review board for certificate of appropriateness. What you could potentially be changing is that you would lose the ability to have that intensity and density if the design review board chose to allow those homes to go.
Explain it again. I'm sorry. So
So-
does this affect the historical overlay then?
No. I just don't want, I don't want us to ever lose, we're talking in generalities here, but don't lose the fact that this is a district that is protected by your local historic district. So Councilmember Strange said, what can we potentially be giving up? And the short answer is, you're potentially giving up more intense development because you are requiring greater setbacks, both front and side. And as the other council member, I know, but I can't remember your last name. Sorry. And I can't read it from here. Councilmember Ellison said, perhaps reducing the height to 40 feet. So what you could potentially be giving up is a more intense development.
So I've got a question, and I think we should investigate. I'd be interested in having a conversation regarding what Andy said about the 40-foot height and further potential setbacks. I got some feedback from people in the community that was appealing. It does seem to make sense as far as maintaining some of the character that currently exists there. One thing, and I think I understand this, but I want to make sure that I do. Currently, when you walk down call it downtown or town center, the east and west side of the streets are pretty dramatically different when it comes to building height, setback, green space, etc. And so I understand I understand how it became that way. But as we talk about the zoning standards going forward, if we're going to talk about sub-districts, I'm just thinking, that you don't wanna have a non-conforming use, right? So the east side of the street, the subway section where really the setback isn't great, there's not the green space, et cetera. You don't wanna put something in that's gonna mandate a certain setback, and then those buildings are all gonna be a non-conforming. So is that where a sub-district would be beneficial to set, circle around those buildings that are right up on the street, more or less, and the sidewalk?
Right, so what you see in purple, and I just, sort of named this, would be Central Business District Downtown Core. And that would say that's the core of your downtown, and it would have standards that would allow the buildings right at the sidewalk, would allow the taller height, would not require any separation between buildings, and it would make all of those structures conforming.
But any existing building, I guess, is obviously grandfathered in. I mean.
Correct.
Yeah, so we're talking about the standards moving forward. Okay, that makes
Yes, Ben, I think what, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the shaded keeps the shaded as is, and doesn't allow that to expand beyond what's currently shaded.
Correct. So the only thing that could potentially change in terms of the built environment would be, let's make the assumption that the post office isn't going anywhere, would be the two banks. And so potentially, those two banks could be torn down, and you could have more intense development at the street, because those two banks are included within that purple. So those buildings themselves could potentially become non-conforming structures. As there could be a conforming use, they'd be non-conforming structures. But again, they can exist forever.
A technical question about that. Let's say both banks and the post office go. The post office was threatened to leave here 5-10 years ago. So those three buildings get empty. So the zoning you're talking about stays there. Would the new building be required to be on the sidewalk, or could they choose to do a setback of like what the buildings are now and add a little green space in front of it?
So we can tailor the standards any way you want.
Okay.
As it's currently shown up there, they would be required to be at the front property line.
Okay.
But,
No.
I mean, that's one way.
Could.
Could be.
They don't have to, they can do exactly what you said under the current.
Yeah, under the current zoning, they could. But, and then we can also, I've chosen 2 sub-districts. You could have 3, or you could even, because you've got a built environment that is constrained by the plots and utilities and streets and all of that, and I know y'all probably talk about this a lot. Flexibility has to, even if we have these definitive standards, flexibility should be built into the ordinance.
So another technical question about that is back to the very beginning, form-based code versus what we have now.
Yes, sir.
Would form-based code help us with this idea?
It would have been very similar to what we're talking about in terms of development standards, but what we are not doing, form-based code is exactly that. It mandates certain forms of buildings. So for example, you would have a certain multifamily type building, for example. That would be a form that would be permitted. We are not doing that in this. All we are taking from form-based code, if you potentially go this route, are some of its standards.
So you don't see any value in going the form-based code route based on everything you've heard over the past year and a half?
So you're asking me a value-laden question.
Yes, I am.
And I personally, after everything I've heard since January and before that, from all of our community members, and I notice I use that R. I feel like a part of your community now. I personally think that form-based code adds an additional level of granularity that would be beneficial to you. Mainly because it mandates the type of buildings that can go within a particular sub-district. But I think we were right to just let that go at this point. And at some point in time, if you're happy with these sub-districts, if they're working for you, and you feel confident that it's going to create a built form or maintain a built form that you like, you can always add that in.
Okay.
But this is a step that gives you more control and more take.
Okay. Thanks.
Did I hear you correctly earlier when you said that the design review board has a purview to change what we do in zoning? I thought you said that when I say to the design review board, to step outside the box, you said something along those lines?
So Design Review Board is really and truly dealing with alterations that are visible from the public right of way as it's defined by your code. So they evaluate buildings based on the adopted guidelines. Whereas what I think I was hopefully saying is that because of the constraints that exist as a result of your existing built environment, that the planning commission, for example, could be given some latitude to grant some waivers in downtown. And we've talked about that with other districts, not just downtown, because of precisely what Mayor Hall said, that you might want a little more flexibility in certain areas, or you may find out that there's, a big water line someplace, or a junction, or whatever else, and would mandate that you couldn't do what the zoning ordinance says because of your existing built environment. So I personally think it would recommend that there be some flexibility, even though you're adding some more discrete standards, more objective standards through this process.
I've always been under the impression that, all our boards are appointed by one person and we're elected. And so I can give a little flexibility, but I'm also under the impression that we're the ones that should fall on the sword because we're the ones that were elected. So some of these bigger decisions I do think should fall to us, like voting on this, you know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, I like to take responsibility for the actions that are given, you know what I mean? I don't want to tie anybody's hands too much with some things, especially when it comes to design review package. I think that it's our responsibility to make sure that they elected us to make those decisions.
So we can do that as well. I mean, it could be.
I want on time a little bit, but not too much where it changes the scheme of the city.
So we certainly could do that as well. The flexibility for, for example, front setbacks or whatever could come to you versus the planning commission. But the important thing tonight is to decide, do you want to have a built environment in the future that it respects your existing built environment and use the tools of it? So I'm hearing that y'all are okay with that. Are y'all okay with that?
Is this what you guys decided? Did you guys come up, you guys work together? So what we're hearing from her is basically what you guys have worked on to this point and are all in agreement with?
We didn't specifically talk about the sub-districts in a lot of detail.
We did talk last meeting about how it's a walking community, and on the east side of the avenue, there really isn't, once you get some seating and treescapes and fire hydrants, there really isn't any space there when you start putting sandwich boards out there too. So I think we do agree that being a walking community, we do want bigger front yards where we can get them.
I like that. I think it's nice to walk through a short area, a short window where you can window shop. For the most part, people are here because of, where Mayberry is what they kept saying in Andy Griffith show. So.
Although I'm concerned with the 50 feet height in the downtown area. 50 feet height, if you get it all the way down, it's going to close it in. It's not going to have that nice, warm feeling as you walk through. I think 40 feet is what it should be. It's my opinion.
I agree. I think a lot of it, we're all nodding our heads.
It just will close it in if you do it on both sides, all the way down that top. That you're not going to get light in there. It's going to look dark. It's not going to have that warm feeling.
So what's currently proposed is only to have to maintain the existing height where it's purple. Everything else would be potentially 40 feet. And then keep in mind that, with the exception of the two banks, most of what's there, is going to be governed by the design review board, and the height won't be increased. So you're talking about
My suggestion earlier was actually the 40 feet for the purple shaded.
Oh, I apologize.
Yes.
I agree. That's what I thought. I thought that's what we were talking about.
Yes, it should be, the purple area should be 40 feet. If everything was torn down there, and you put 50 feet up there, that's going to close it in. Even if it was set back a little bit, it's still going to have that feeling that's closed in, like a downtown Cincinnati. You feel closed in.
You want light, you want.
Yes.
I know. I agree with you.
Yeah. So if it was torn down, even if you put it set back a little bit and only made it 40 feet, you're still going to have that warm feeling in there. You're going to have more sunlight.
Now, I liked what you suggested too about having to make sure to guarantee that if anything is built, that if they're row, there's separation, so they look nice and uniform, but not.
One thing to consider though, somebody could buy 4 or 5 of those lots, consolidate those lots into a lot, build what they want.
But only 40 feet.
Only to 40 feet, correct. But they wouldn't necessarily be discrete. They wouldn't be discrete little houses. They would be.
Well, then what she showed, can't we
So we can mandate,
Right.
I mean, again, let's separate our conversation, and I apologize that I misunderstood. So we're going, some of these things are numbers, like we can put 40 feet in for the purple area, something else for outside the purple area. And then if we come back in phase 3, decide we want to do something different, that's a number on a chart and we can fix it. In terms of outside of the purple area, we can actually mandate maximum building width. We can mandate, even if it is just one lot, you can mandate maximum building width. You can mandate that the width of bays has to be a certain amount so that you get vertical divisions. There are all sorts of things that we can do, which don't exist today, to ensure, for example, outside of the purple area, that even if all of those were bought and torn down, you would still have separation between buildings and still have a front setback. And that's the benefit of this process, is establishing that type of vision and then codifying it through the code.
And maybe less than 40.
Yeah, exactly. And that was gonna be my next question. I mean, what do we think?
Does 35 to 40 make that big a difference for someone?
Yes.
It does.
I'm sorry, from a construction standpoint, that's what I meant.
So
Like, does that 5 more feet make any difference? Because at 35 feet, at 40 feet, you're probably still only building 2 stories, right? So at 35 feet, you're building 2 stories, right?
at 35 feet, you're definitely building 2 stories. You're not gonna get anything any higher.
And that still allows you to have a ceiling height for both floors.
Yeah, I mean, the real question comes down to pro forma, if you have a commercial building, does 2 floors ever make any sense?
Correct, and that was the next point I was gonna make. I mean, we are talking today in a vacuum about creating place and creating standards, but what's not been entered into that vacuum is exactly what Dave said, which is, while we may think these are all great standards and create a great place, it may be a disincentive for redevelopment because the pro forma doesn't make sense. And where that's important would be for Fifth Third Bank and then the 2 other banks, because I personally find it difficult to believe that drive-throughs are a good thing in your downtown, and you may want those, particularly those 3 sites, to rebuild and redevelop. And only saying 35 feet may be a hindrance to that.
You could say that, put it in, leave it there, let it sit for, because that's somewhat speculation, if no one wanted to know, who knows? It sits there for 3 years or whatever, pick a time period, and you don't see the development.
Well, they requested
You
40
could
feet.
raise it to 40, right? I mean, it's a fairly easy process to build, operating costs.
So it depends on how we structure the ordinance. If it's just a number in the chart, then they would have to go in front of the board of zoning appeal, the board of adjustment, and ask for a variance. Or we can structure it such that they would come to you as you having the ability to then exceed the maximum height. There are different ways to build that flexibility in if we want to do that. So we can do that as well.
You could have it zone 35 and put it adjusted for adjustment and go to 40.
Or, because there are certain standards, and I apologize for interrupting, because there are certain standards that the Board of Adjustment should follow when granting the variance, I would recommend that if that's something that you think is feasible, that it should then have some sort of ability to have flexibility either through the Planning Commission or through you, so that you're evaluating it outside of the legal standards for a variance.
Elisa, can I make a point of clarification, because I know you're talking about the existing built environment. For what you've told us on Thursdays is the entirety of the what are you going to call downtown here, with the exception of 1 Highland, the existing built environment is 35 feet. Is that correct?
Well, it depends.
I'm talking as it exists today, as we sit here.
Well, I mean, the height of buildings are different. Some of them are 2 stories, some of them are 1 story, some of them are 2.5. But yes, I mean, there's, generally speaking, you're not gonna have anything in downtown right now, other than 1 Highland taller than 35 feet. With Women's Club, you're right, Women's Club might be.
Okay. I have a.
We'll have a comment at the end here.
So I'm gonna, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Jen.
Okay. I really need some clarification between using the word sub-district and subdivide the CBD. And it's just one person mentioned. So if we just subdivide the CBD, take that part out, if we take a piece out of the CBD and it's no longer CBD, that removes any of the local historical.
So we're not talking about, that at all.
No, I know, but the phrase was used, if we just subdivide that and take it out. Sub-district, I'm all for it, like, I understand a good reason for sub-district, but I don't think that, I want clarification that we're not interchanging the word sub-district and subdividing, meaning pulling it out. Like, my understanding when we started all of this is that none of the zones would be changing the perimeters.
Did anyone say subdivide?
Yes.
I didn't catch that.
If I did, that's
You meant
not what I
sub-
meant.
That's not gonna happen.
Okay.
If I did, I used the wrong word. I apologize.
But the answer to the question is no. We're talking about just the sub-districts. There will be no
I just wanted the
subdivision.
clarification because if it's on the record that it
That's
says
what I'm giving.
subdivide, I just wanted to clarify.
No, it's a good question.
All right, if y'all are comfortable, we got a lot of ground to cover. So, and this is not gonna be the close of this conversation, right? I mean, this is the opening of the conversation. But what I have heard, to recap, y'all are okay with the purple being one sub-district, outside of the purple being a different one. Outside of the purple, we want front setbacks, we want separation between buildings, we want to decrease building height. And even within the purple, we want to decrease building height to 4 feet. Have I caught it?
The only question I had is, where is the Fifth Third Bank? I can't really tell.
Oh, I'm sorry, the Fifth Third Bank would be, you see the so you got one Highland,
Yeah.
thank you, right there.
So we're not including that in the sub-district, or we are?
So everything outside that is not purple would be a different sub-district. And again, these are lines on a map, we can easily massage those as we move forward. The important thing is creating the sub-districts and having a basic understanding of what the development standards are.
So this is just to protect us, so we don't have any more like intense development, is what you're saying?
This would then protect you or create a different built environment, yes. All right, so we're still in downtown, but we're moving on to use. So currently, first floor residential uses are prohibited in the central business district, which consequently means all of downtown. You cannot have a residential use on the first floor.
Is it the same way in the Midway District?
It is. We'll get there in a minute.
Okay.
I apologize. I was just trying to find a discreet way to subdivide all of these conversations. Sorry.
Careful.
So perhaps, we only retain that prohibition on the first floor against floor residential in this sort of purple area. And this change would, the use would add some flexibility. Are y'all okay with that? So meaning, in the purple area, we'd be prohibited to have a residential use on the first floor. Outside of the purple, you could have residential.
Yeah, there's a lot of history behind this whole thing about not allowing residential on the first floor, and that goes back to when all these buildings were being transformed back in the 70s and 80s, where you took a storefront and just threw in dilapidated apartments, and it happened all over the place. So that's why all the zoning changed to prevent that from happening, which doesn't mean that there might be an opportunity to have some nice residential on the first floor, but that would be one way to control it, is make the core CBD still disallowed, but let one of the sub, whatever the word is, allow for residential.
I think this is more comfortable than when we first started out, because you took the houses out that people were concerned with, between Fifth Third and the Sonic Lodge, the potential of single families and use of green space. So I think this area is already businesses. In my opinion, until I hear otherwise, which I'm sure we will.
So that would allow in between, the Fifth Third Bank and the beginning of the, I guess the old, you could then tear down all those houses and build townhouses.
Thank you.
Right?
Yes.
So potentially, but don't,
So with setback. Not with the setback and
But
the
not-
spacing.
And then spacing, right?
again, don't forget,
You could just tear them all down and make it one lot.
And the way it's,
No.
the way it looks now,
Yes.
we can change that.
We can change it, and we can put, each building has to have so much space in between, and maybe just one, like, not two townhouses, just one townhouse.
You can control how wide it is.
Yes.
control how wide it is.
Or, correct.
and I've heard, from community members, and I think from Alvin, is that, for example, on the west side of the street, north of, Shone, you really and truly do want to keep that rhythm of separate buildings and front setbacks. And so we can build standards in.
Yeah, we're just discussing one area, and we'll get back to that and discuss how we want to zone that, right? The layers of protection on that at some point, right?
We will,
Yes.
we'll.
That's what I thought, I'm glad you asked that question. We're not leaving it the same as it is right now.
Well, the question just was, by having residential on the first floor, I could buy all those houses, tear them all down, and make it one lot and build a whole bunch of townhouses.
Potentially, but again, you would have to have building separations and you would have to go through the design review board to get approvals from all.
So the buildings would also have a list.
Correct.
They could.
They could, yes, that would be a potential standard that we would add, and that's what I'm going to draft and bring back before you.
So that you're coming up with that next.
Yes, sir.
But there's other ways to do that based on those pictures you showed, where you have a building that's a wider building, but it looks like different buildings because of the vertical stuff in it.
Correct.
Because it would not probably be logical for someone to tear all those buildings down and rebuild basically the same size building.
Probably, correct. But again,
I would like to revisit this at some point for tax abatements for those that try to get those families back on our side of things, if that's possible too, so. I think, yeah, that's.
all right, so at this point, we will only prohibit residential on the first floor in that purple area. Are we all okay with that?
Check one. 6 more to go.
Okay, so now we're gonna really get into a technical conversation. So, as we talked about, those 6 homes, between the Masonic Lodge and Fifth Third Bank, some of them have the first floor have been converted to offices, and other cases, the homes are used as single-family homes. And so at this point in the downtown, those people who occupy them as single-family homes are occupying them as a non-conforming use. The current zoning ordinance greatly restricts what you can do when you have a non-conforming use. Basically, you can't expand it at all. So the question before you is, for these homes, should it be, again, we just made a decision to only have the prohibition for purple. This is actually a separate decision, so that's why I say it's technical. Should these homes be permitted as a permitted use within the central business district? And we can do that a couple of different ways. We can just say all single family is a permitted use, or we can say the single family homes that existed the day the ordinance passed are then permitted uses. That makes them conforming. There are 2 that are currently being used as single family homes. At least it appears that way from the sidewalk. I did not go stare.
So we're gonna let them alone.
No, we're not allowed to do that. So, do we want to make these a permitted use?
Yes.
Moving on.
And that's not to say now, somebody could come in and tear down one of those houses and build a new house. And if they want a new house, they probably want a garage, a driveway.
So my recommendation is going to be that you only make it permitted use if the structure existed today, the ordinance passed. That way, you're protecting them, you're giving them the ability to invest in their home, but you're not really potentially changing the character of downtown at all.
But they could still put additions onto this, so.
Sure, if they want to put additional with that, they
And
could
would
do
they
that.
have to go before the design review board to do that, to get a certificate of appropriateness?
So depending upon how the lot is structured and how the building is on the lot, they may not have to, because the way the current design review ordinance is written, it's only alterations that are visible from the street. So, for example, if you want to put a deck on the back, that would not have to.
They may need to go to adjustment.
They might have to go to board of adjustment, which is a whole other issue.
Right now, would you be allowed to have a garage like you said?
So right now, they cannot, they can't expand at all because it's non-conforming.
What about replacing it with something we're having to, sure.
So they'd be in trouble right now.
Yeah, it's about a commercial building.
You have to put up a commercial building if that home were.
What about after this new zoning is put in
Then
place?
it could be either way, it could be a new house or a commercial building.
So you're saying either way, no matter, all those buildings could go back to single family homes if they want to? Or only,
It's up to the property.
If,
will be?
if this ordinance change is made, that
If
if the
we do what
structure,
we talked about.
Okay.
if the structure existed the day the ordinance passed, if someone wanted to convert it back to a single-family home, they would be permitted to do so.
Okay. I was getting confused there. I thought it was, when we passed ordinance, it had to stay like it was.
When would that take effect? Is that what we're talking at the end of 24 for the, I'm just talking about those 6 houses? When this whole process is complete, that would be, their zoning would change to where they could have.
Correct.
Is there a way we can speed that up?
Sure. If y'all desire to do so,
I
we can
thought
make
you
that
were
change.
trying to buy them before.
You know, I did want to say that when we do start bringing this stuff out to the council to pass, I would like it broken down into pretty understandable, I'd say small, but understandable segments instead of one thick binder, because it is a lot, and obviously there's some questions, and I'm still a little confused with some of the stuff, so the areas, if they were broken down, for us to pass, would be easier for me to review personally, to get through, so any questions I may have, I'm not gonna answer this in a lump sum, so nothing sneaks by me, because we are gonna be the ones that are gonna be held accountable, for these changes, like it or not.
Yeah, we've already discussed that.
Okay.
That we're gonna go, I mean, a lot of sections we may go for votes by section.
I like that idea.
Again, 6 of you to vote yes on one ordinance like this might be challenging. So we might just go through sections to see majority on special sections. So that's kind of what we've already discussed that.
So back to my question, are there any property owners there now that would find benefit in doing enhancements to their house or turning it back into a single family that we know of? Have you guys ever been approached by that? So we're not in a hurry to do it, so we're okay to include it?
Well, they were not allowed.
Yeah, they can't right now.
Well,
They- they wouldn't bring it.
Did anybody express interest in doing that to where we?
Kevin, you,
Okay. Well, if, Kevin, if somebody does, if they watch this and they do approach you, will you let us know so we can maybe expedite that? Just that section?
And that's a really easy amendment to make that down.
Melissa, there are a number of buildings on that side that look like they could be residences, but you're talking about just the ones that are currently in use.
So what we're talking about doing is for all of those, changing the use table and say, if the structure existed the day the ordinance was passed, the single-family detached dwelling would be a permitted use. But again, that really doesn't harm anybody. All that does is say for the person, one or two people who currently own homes there, if they want to expand or invest, they can do so. And then if anyone wants to convert, they'd be allowed to do so. So we're adding options, we're not adding restrictions. So the final topic for downtown is the boundaries of CBD. So as I've been talking to community members, many have expressed surprise that the homes on Miller and Lumley are zoned Central Business District. Some have asked for them to be returned or to be zoned R1C because they have a concern about businesses creeping down Miller and Lumley. I should also point out that there are single-family homes on Audubon and one on Forest that are also zoned Central Business District. Again, I think these boundaries were established in 1999, as we were talking about earlier. As we start to have this discussion about potentially pulling these homes out of the Central Business District and changing that line, that people do have investment-backed expectations when they buy a property and it's zoned Central Business District. Zoning really does affect property values, and so the decision that you could potentially be making to pull them out could be impacting people. So I don't want to skirt over that. In addition, in the zoning ordinance, in most ordinances, there are constraints when you have a commercial zoning next to a residential zoning. So therefore, which would then impact the commercial property because of landscaping and buffering requirements. So you could potentially be constraining redevelopment or development or investment if these properties are pulled out and become zoned residential R1C, for example. So I'm bringing it forward to you because, as I said, community members have said, had surprised that these homes were zoned central business district and asked for this to be a topic of discussion. So what is your thought process?
That was very well described. My daughter actually had one of those houses one time, had no idea. Didn't really affect them until they wanted to add on to a deck on the back, and they just had to go to Board of Adjustment to get that process approved. So it really didn't hurt them, but your comment about it could be very restrictive because of on a potential future development in that lot. So I would, having experienced that myself, I would submit just leaving it the way it is because I don't see it having to have a negative effect on those 4 or 5 houses that are actually, there's more than that, but even one on the end, that may change as well, because I don't see a negative effect that it's having.
No, I have some personal experience with this in Dayton. I owned an industrial non-conforming. I bought it, that did not show up anywhere. And when I went to sell it, it showed up. So the mortgage company, they couldn't get insurance on it.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
If there is a way to deal with the potential, I think there is potential to redevelop a block where the market is and where the bank is. And so however those properties adjacent to it would affect that, maybe there's a different way to cover it.
So that actually wouldn't be an issue right now because there are no single family homes between Fort Thomas and Haddon in that block. So this would not impact that at all. So we're really talking about.
Well, you were saying that if someone tried to redevelop that because of
So it'd be more applicable, say, for where the independent school building is at the corner. Because it's cheap by jowl right there, the home next to that parking lot. So if the school district wanted to add on, essentially, in a very simplistic way, if they wanted to add on the building to the side, they could not go really very far deep back onto the lot. Because they would then, if you pull it out, they would then have to have a buffer yard or some sort of screening and fencing that would prevent them.
Somebody in the middle block would not have to have a buffer.
Correct.
Okay, then I'm not worried.
Personally, I think part of our job is to protect our community as much as to help it grow. You know what I mean, a little bit. And sometimes you have to make tough decisions, and I do fear that leaving it open for interpretation may not allow us to have control over that. And I think people want homes here. This is what they're looking for. And like Eric said, his daughter bought it not knowing. He always assumes it's a single family house. So that's how it is. I mean, sometimes you gotta make those tough decisions. It seems to me that it's pretty obvious to keep them,
My recommendation is if we're interested in making those and taking them out of the CBD, is that the staff contact those 10 houses and just see what the owners' opinions are. Because that is gonna be a challenge, and I don't know if it's any what kind of liability there is if we change it into homes against their will, because they did buy it with that purpose. I think that
areas around people without their will.
Well, but it's different. We talked about that. When you change a property that I already own compared to properties around me, it is different. But regardless, I mean, you're right, Adam, we can do it without their approval, but there might be some liability hanging out there. I think it would be good for the staff before we kind of go any farther, if everybody seems like they agree, just at least get their opinion.
No, I
So we
agree.
can see, this may be a non-issue, all 10 of them say, no, I want this to be a house, cut me out, that'll give me more flexibility, and we can move forward. So I think on that aspect, if we can just handle that.
Sure.
Or keep them, determined part of the subdistrict.
We could do that as well. We could also
Make
make
them
them.
into their own.
Yeah. Does add to what is not gonna be part of the subdistrict.
We could.
Like the ones across the street from.
Regardless, it would be good to know the owner's intentions.
Right, so we could do one of two things. We we can create a different sub-district, or we could put it, for lack of a better way of putting it, in the sub-district that's outside the purple.
That's a great idea.
So we can do either one of those things.
That way, it's their choice, it actually gives them more flexibility.
It does give them more flexibility, so. All right, so let's, I mean, I perfectly concur with that, I don't mean to be disrespectful. But let's go under that assumption and come back with how to handle it as opposed to changing the boundary. All right, so now we're gonna move on to Midway and talk about character considerations in terms of building form and placement. Okay. So before we start that, we're also gonna take another very brief tour of the Midway. So let's review that built environment. The Midway District starts at the one-story building that currently houses Grassroots and Vine. And as you progress down the street, there's a mix of one- and two-story buildings that are all built right at the sidewalk. And then there's a break in the street wall after the Chinese restaurant when you get to Midway Court. The street wall picks back up on the other side of Midway Court with individual historic buildings that are keeping with traditional Main Street buildings. Before you get to the furniture store, you have two one-story buildings with parking in between them that have placed in front of a single-family home. I did a little bit of trespassing to find that out. The one-story buildings is the best furniture gallery, and the building placement restores the street wall there, and the building's corner treatment takes advantage of the curve in the road to mark both place, in terms of creating place, and then enhance their storefront. They've done a really nice job of creating that corner. After best furniture, the rhythm of the storefront breaks down with multiple driveways and the building placement with varying front setbacks. Because of this breakdown, this portion of Midway really does lack walkability. There's just no reason to keep strolling, and the area becomes more car-oriented and less pedestrian-oriented. We now cross the street at Brentwood. Development on this side of the street also lacks rhythm with different building types and building placements. On the south side of Brentwood, there is one home that is zoned Central Business District that has been used for business for a number of years, according to what I was told. On the other side of Brentwood, we have the structure that is commonly referred to as the Ice House that currently has offices in it, I believe. And then next to the Ice House, there are 5 residential homes. Some of these have been divided into multiple units, that it appears. Across Shawnee from this one-story building is a one-story building that currently houses a brew pub, I believe. And next door to it is an older office building that has a front setback that has nothing but parking in it. And then across Garrison from this office building is a traditional 2-story Main Street building. At the corner of South Fort Thomas and River Road, traditional Main Street commercial returns at the corner. Across River Road, on this side of the street, is the VA property. So, should the development standards be altered in the South Fort Thomas and River Road area? While we have seen that variability in the building placement on both sides of Fort Thomas Avenue, restoring or creating a more coherent building placement does seem to make some sense in a good way. For the non-residential uses, I would recommend retaining the existing development standards. If you want to talk about reducing height, we certainly can do that. And I would also recommend putting in definitive setbacks, as we talked about earlier.
Definitive setback?
Yes. Instead of it all being left to the planning commission's discretion. Do you have any concerns with this approach?
It's the same as the one we just came up with, or you guys have discussed it?
So I think that based on what I just currently heard and the built form that's out there, potentially the only change to the development standards might be the height. Currently the maximum height in this district for Midway is 50 feet. Do we want to bring it down any? For example, if those two interesting buildings are torn down next to the furniture building, would you want to see something potentially 50 feet tall there? I think that it would greatly disrupt the street wall and the rhythm of the street, personally. So I would think, again, bringing the height down to something more like 40 feet and putting in definitive setbacks makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Did you say earlier in our meeting that, currently none of the buildings exceed 50 or exceed 40 feet?
Correct, the tallest one, and again, this is based on using Google Earth, so it could be a little bit off, is the building with the pub, and it's about 40.
About 40, okay.
And it's 3 stories.
What about the properties not on the avenue that are residential, uses residential now? Would we get the same option?
So we're gonna talk about that a little bit more in a minute, if that's okay. And if we don't discuss it in a way that you find appropriate, let me know. Just let me know. So like we discussed for downtown, for the non-residential uses, I would also recommend including building standards that regulate building width and facade treatments, as we talked about as well. If it's okay with you, I would move into discussing the residential uses on the first floor and dwellings in the midway. Any concerns? Like downtown, residential uses are prohibited on the first floor throughout midway. And what I would suggest doing here, given the variability of setbacks and all of that, and to enhance walkability, where you see the red line on the map, that's where we would prohibit residential on the first floor, and then nowhere else. So essentially, it would go from Grassroots and Vine all the way down to the entrance to the reservoir.
It's currently like that now, though?
So currently, yes, residential on the first floor is prohibited all of the midway. And what I'm
You're talking to
suggesting.
the furniture store, entrance to the restaurant, that's the same as furniture store.
Yes, sir.
Can you go back to one slide real quick?
But there's still, there's existing buildings.
Doesn't that building have residences on the first floor?
It does, and it's non-conforming today. So what we're proposing just keeps that non-conformity in place. But it does limit the prohibition to just that area. So for example, where the market is, if that redeveloped, I'm sorry, if the market redeveloped, you could have residential on the first floor because it would be south of the reservoir.
Then why not extend that down so that like why not the rest of it?
So truthfully, you have limited demand for commercial development, given the lack of being a retail, as someone said earlier, and the lack of density in terms of dwelling units that you have in that area. So you are, in my opinion, unnecessarily restricting redevelopment by prohibiting residential on the first floor south of there.
And I think honestly, then it doesn't box it in and kind of opens it up there too as well.
Right, yeah, it just adds flexibility. If someone wanted to put a commercial space there, they could. But if they wanted to put a residential building there, they could do that as well. So it just adds flexibility.
I'm trying to remember, what did we decide with the zoning district of the hospital?
We're getting there.
I'm sorry, I know we talked about it.
We're getting there, I promise.
Can we zone out the use of a hospital?
Yeah, there we go.
Well, the VA is likely to go away.
Yeah.
And so we had a lot of discussion about what to do in terms of the use of that.
Right, we do. And at that point in time, and do you mind if I defer that for just a second? So currently, there are those 5 homes that I showed you next to the tavern, and then Midway Court. Potentially, we could create a sub-district for those particular areas that would respect and legitimize the existing uses, and then have some development standards that make sense. Or we can, have the same development standards for all of it. But I'm asking you the question: are these uses special enough that we should create a sub-district for them?
I guess what would be the pros and cons to that?
So the pro is, right now, as we just talked about, all of those are non-conforming. Both those homes on South Fort Thomas and on Midway Court. So this would then, as I said, legitimize the use. It would make the single-family homes, and one of the on South Fort Thomas, one of those is being converted to, I know, 2 units, and then one on Midway Court is also being converted to more than one dwelling unit in this space. So we would be legitimizing those uses, and then we would have development standards that make sense for them. So that's the value of creating those sub-districts. So what that would do also, just to be really frank with you, is constrain any redevelopment of Midway Court. It is a part of the historic district, but if we create a sub-district that, you know, allows two-family and single-family and has development standards that reflect that, then you are essentially memorializing what's there. But again, it's already memorialized because it's in the historic district. To a certain extent.
What historic significance do those houses have?
So according to the application that was put forth when this was made a National Register District, and frankly it was because of Mr. Wilmore that I looked at it, the Register District said that those houses were formed because people who worked at the fort lived in them. So it was an integral part of the Midway area and how it ultimately developed in respect to the fort.
And what would you look at putting there? What form would you put there? What would you allow? Like two families, you said, like townhomes?
We can go different ways with this. We can create them as sub-districts that all it does is legitimize what's there, meaning single family and two family, and creates development standards that are realistic for those small lots. That's one approach. And that just respects what's there and keeps it there forever until you change it.
They're pretty thin lots, aren't they?
I'm sorry?
They're thin.
Well, the problem is that they're also not very deep on one side of Midway Court, and then they are narrow and small on the other side of Midway Court. So they are in and of themselves developmentally challenged, for sure, just because of the way the parcels were ultimately laid out. So there's that approach. The other approach would be realizing how challenged they are, even though it is the historic district, and permit other types of housing units there. But the first question is, do you want to then create something that legitimizes what's there? That's the fundamental question, and then we can go, if not, then we can talk about what it means to do something.
I would actually look at them separately. The ones down here on the avenue, I'm good with the idea of keeping them as residential. I don't know about the restrictions. Is that Midway Court? Is that just talking about the ones behind?
Yes, the area that is.
I don't know about the restrictions on that. And the only reason I say that, there was an opportunity for someone who was considering bringing a business in, and they may have been in a position to want to purchase a house or two to provide parking or warehousing or something in order to facilitate that business. So I don't know either whether that could happen today or not. Under current zoning, could somebody buy up those houses and do something with it to add on to the back of their building?
So under the current zoning, you could, but you would have to apply the design review board to demolish them. Their approval to demolish them. So,
I just don't see those, I see those differently than the ones on the other.
all right. So I think, is everyone okay with, because when we talked about this originally, but y'all were okay with creating a sub-district for the homes on South Fork Thomas. Midway Court was a little touchier in terms of the discussions. Why don't we parking lot, I'm sorry.
I agree with Mayor House, separated from.
Okay, so let's create a separate sub-district for it and sort of parking lot, what that means in terms of. Oh, I'm sorry.
I don't know what it means.
Yeah, sorry. Bad use of facilitation language. And delay conversation about what that means in terms of use and form. Okay, so let's do that.
You guys agree with that?
What about the other properties that are affected back there but aren't either shaded or discussed?
Here we go. So now we're gonna move into the boundaries. And I think that will address that conversation now. So the Midway Business District is influenced by two properties that are currently zoned Central Business District. One is the Cincinnati Bell site, which is zoned R3, and the other property is the VA Hospital, which is zoned R1. For the VA Hospital, the community plan states in the event the VA Hospital leaves, encourage adaptive reuse for housing. For the Cincinnati Bell property, the community plan states that there's a need for additional parking behind the businesses on the north end of the Midway district. And the plan suggests acquiring land from Cincinnati Bell to accommodate this need for parking. So essentially, should those parcels be rezoned to central business district? Incorporating the VA hospital into the CBD would facilitate redevelopment and help integrate the site into the Midway business district. Right now, people feel like it is. Like, I don't think anyone realizes that it's zoned residential, but we could create a sub-district for it and really and truly think about at a strategic level what it should be in the future. And then for the Cincinnati Bell property, it's a large site, it's approximately 2.86 acres, which could both accommodate any new parking from the way, plus allow for the expansion of the Midway business district in the future. So, are you open to expanding the boundaries for these two parcels?
What's the downside?
Again, that's a value question, but I don't think there isn't. I think that you want, right now, when someone looks at that, for example, the VA property, it's zoned R1C, they have no idea what you want to happen there. All they know is that it's zoned residential. And if we create a sub-district for it and standards and uses, then at least we're giving a clue as to what it should be in the future, should it change.
Does that restrict us if we zone it commercial, a developer could purchase it, but if we zone it a different way, can we protect it so the city can acquire the park?
I'm sorry, I don't think I understand. I mean, you can zone that and include any types of uses that you want.
Okay, well, I guess that wouldn't happen because it's got to go through us. The federal government can't pass down to private development. So
they can go to the highest and best use after it first starts with the federal government, then the state, then you all, then a private government.
Yeah, so we could stop it. If we wanted it as part of the park, we would have a chance.
If you're willing to pony up the money.
Yeah, basically we have to match whatever offer they're clear about, right?
And the reality is both of these properties are large enough and influential enough that market drives that 5 years down the road, something completely different is proposed. We can look at the site and say, okay, we can make a change because this makes a lot of sense.
Right, and then I think the other part of your question is this. We can't simply zone it something that doesn't make sense. We have to give it a reasonable use.
Yeah, so we can't zone somebody out for buying.
Correct, right? You just can't zone it park and expect that to stand. It's not, you don't have to give the highest and best use, but you do have to give it use.
They have to have some reasonable relationship to your comprehensive plan.
Yeah, you want that.
Well, it does, part of the park.
So.
It's 2.8 acres of the parking space.
All right, so I'm going to expand it there and start thinking conceptually about what that sub-district would look like and bring it back to you. How does that sound? Okay.
Is that changing the border of the CBD? Is that extending the border of the CBD?
It could be, potentially.
Would that still be protected by the local historical zone, which the CBD is?
So we would have to, depending upon what the will of this board is, these boards is, we could, if you just at a very broad level extend the CBD zoning, then yes, you would be enforcing it through design review. But if the board chooses not to do that, we could do that as well. So that's a question that's still left to be answered.
Would you do the VA, make it in R1?
It currently is R1.
Okay, then. But it would still retain the R1 if the VA hospital went away.
Correct. If the VA hospital went away tomorrow and the zoning is not changed, it would still be zoned R1C.
Which means they wouldn't be able to make it the park.
Well, a park is a permitted use, but it means they couldn't use it for anything other than, they really couldn't use it at all. Other than for houses.
For houses.
You could tear it down and put houses there.
Right.
So similar to what we talked about for the homes on Miller and Lumley, some community members have expressed concern about businesses creeping down Garrison, Shawnee, Southview, and Grandview. As I said, we talked about property values and all of those things. So should these parcels be removed? Should we make them permitted uses? How should we move forward as we think about?
Just take the same approach we did in CBD.
So any owner doesn't necessarily say, you're not hurting it.
But you were just saying you were gonna ask.
It's, yeah, if we need.
All right, so now I'll turn the floor to you. Anything else that you want to talk about in terms of downtown?
Lisa, the only, there were those 5 homes in between the ice house and down there, those 5 skin ones. Did you just address those in that last one?
If we could, just real quick, I need to make sure this takes place and then we'll go to public comment.
But Tim, nothing's being finalized for sure here, right?
I understand, but right
I just
now,
wanted- okay.
she had asked them if they have any conversation between one another.
Elisa, I just have a question. When we talk about the building height all over, some of our discussions previous have been roof types and putting limitations on roof types, not allowing flat roofs in some places and peak roofs and I mean even to the slope, et cetera. And I don't know if council has had the benefit of some of those conversations. I know we talked about earlier that one Highland, 50 foot at the top, but it's got a sloped roof. And the difference between that and if you're gonna reduce some of the height allowed in the different districts, if you want to restrict roof types or do any of that as well.
So you certainly could. It's an unusual requirement in a downtown to restrict the roof types, especially as you're talking about reducing the height. But it is something you could regulate if you chose to do so. You could, but most people, unless they're attempting, most communities, unless they're attempting to have a certain aesthetic, like an Alpine Village or something like that, don't typically regulate whether it's a peak roof or a flat roof or whatever else in a commercial setting. But it is something you could regulate if you chose to do so.
Do you see, especially if you don't have any setback, if you're right at the property line, do you see any difference in allowing 40 feet there or 40 foot at the property line or 50 feet if you want to do a sloped roof that isn't right at the front? I'm just asking if that's something that's a consideration. I think what everybody is expressed concern about is that facade, right there at the street. And, I'm just thinking about restricting use and the commercial restriction based on, it's not economically feasible if you can't get enough height and whatever else. It's a question more than.
It's actually a really good one. And you have 2 parcels that stand out in my head right now. One is where, I may have my bank wrong, but US Bank, and the other one is Fifth Third. You could, because of the depth of those parcels, say 40 feet, and this is a kind of a different question to what you're saying, 40 feet at the front property line, but X feet back, you could be taller. That is also a way of doing it for parcels that have depth, that might make redevelopment more, make the perform work. And that's actually a really good suggestion.
And that might be something you could just do through the planning and zoning board of adjustment to allow some flexibility in that. I'm curious about the 40 foot, whether it should be 39 feet, 43 feet, or whatever. How much? If you're building a new building, what do you need to get 3 stories? And if you want to get 12 feet on the first floor and 10 and 10, is that enough with it? I'm just curious if maybe it's not 50, but maybe it's not 40, maybe it's 43 or 45 or some other technical amount. And the idea about the slope on One Highland, that was done purposely to visually bring the size of the building down, and I like that comment. But once you're further back, you could go up higher and and visually it won't have the same effect as it was right on the street.
So I think we need to do that. We need to add that kind of a standard. I think that makes a good approach. But to answer your, I don't know, I need to do the math, to be honest with you. And the math is the width of the street, the depths of the parcels, so that, and the other thing, 2 things about those 2 parcels is they don't have single family homes directly behind them that would be impacted. So I just need to do the math before I can think about what that standard would be. If that's
So then parking would stay, right?
The parking would not be, from this point forward, there would never be any parking allowed in the front of the building. That is the single worst element to decrease walkability, is parking in the front. Because nobody likes walking up. So the building would move forward potentially.
You have to have a lot of land to be far enough off the street to go 50 feet to allow that. Wouldn't you be able to have parking in the back?
Well, you don't necessarily have to have parking in downtown, it's not required. But those two parcels are pretty deep. Both the Fifth Third Bank and
The third one is
the US Bank, I believe, I could be wrong, are pretty deep. So I need to do the math. And it may not work, right? But it's worth looking into. But to answer your other question about the roofs, as the mayor was saying, conceptually, a flat roof has much more mass than a peaked roof. But since you're reducing the height, I'm not sure that you want to mandate that it only be a peaked roof, for example, because then your third floor becomes less than useful for attention.
So the site where the Fifth Third is, that was part of the not purple section. So that's the area we were talking about, 30, right?
Oh, that's true, we were, that's true. But again, the same concept. Yeah, it'd be 30, 40. Like you would go potentially higher further back. No.
But not 50.
But not feet, no. I don't think that's appropriate there. And it may not work anyway. But it's worth looking at the lot to see if it makes sense. Look at the lot, look at the topography, look at the width of the street, and see if it makes sense. Because the perception is at the sidewalk, you don't want height. But, 150 feet back on that lot, it might work.
Yeah, general consensus is we don't want to close it off. We don't want to be a major downtown, which we walk away.
Right, exactly. But the perception would be very different if that 40 feet, for example, is 150 feet back from the street. Because that's a really deep lot. But you're right, it would be shorter because it's outside the door. All right, any other topics?
I know there was a lot of interest in the historic district. Do you guys have any questions or comments about that?
Just want to make sure the historic overlay stays in place. Personally.
So you need to understand in this case, so there was two separate, the Midway's separate from the CBD. So in 2008, the city actually embarked on a process to have a portion of the Midway was actually qualified by the Kentucky Heritage Council and the National Park Service as a historic district. In the CBD, there's never been, to my knowledge, there's never been a historic survey of any of the structures in the CBD. So we created what we call a local historic district, but in terms of the state and federal government, there's really nothing there, essentially. So you're not eligible for any tax credits. It's not governed by anything from the Kentucky Heritage Council. If a property owner wanted to come back or wanted to have their property surveyed and they had it done professionally, you can't, and it comes back that it's not historic, you really can't make it historic district. Or you can't really say it's historic when it really isn't. So I guess one of the discussions we've had is that the city is really serious about preserving that as a historic district. And you really should go through the effort to have a professional survey done of the CBD and determine what they call each building is either contributing or not contributing. Like the Fifth Third obviously is not contributing. It's not a historic district or a historic building, I'm sorry. And probably half of the buildings in the CBD aren't historic. Maybe half could be, but you really don't know because it's never been surveyed professionally. So I think it would really be worth the city's effort to go down that road and have that work done. And then if there are historic buildings, or at least a group of historic buildings, so maybe the 6 houses we've been talking about, then you can actually nominate those to be on the National Register of Historic Places. But none of that activity ever occurred. And so I think, my recommendation would be, if you're really serious about that from a policy perspective and a historic preservation perspective, then you really ought to consider going down that road. And it's not something that has to happen tomorrow or the next year, but as you move forward, the whole intent of the design review board in a local historic district as it was originally constituted in the Main Street program was to go down that road and do those steps, which never occurred.
Matt, we talked about, I asked you what a landmark was, and the design review board was never actually surveyed to label buildings as landmarks or not, correct?
I don't know if they've actually done that. I'm still, one of my processes.
Yeah, well, it has to be done by a professional historian through the Kentucky Heritage Council. You can't
So
just.
that could recommend what a landmark was.
Correct. But that's, as far as I know, that's never been done.
I doubt very seriously that the CBD here would qualify. I was involved in Newport for a long time.
As a district, I don't know that.
You might have a building or two that could qualify individually, and honestly, the advantage is from tax standpoint is not all that great anymore. But calling the local historic district and having a design review board is a lot of benefits because.
Right, I mean, you can still have an overlay district and have a design review board.
Right.
And I think sometimes people get confused because architectural character is not necessarily the same thing as historic, I mean, historic industrial. So it's not actually apples to apples necessarily. It can be, but it isn't necessarily. You know, the majority of Fort Thomas, actually, the peak of our growth was from 1910 to 1920, or I'm sorry, 1920 to 1930. We gained almost 6,000 residents during that period, and that's when the majority of what we're considering the CBD and the Midway to some degree, they were all built in the 1920s. And in the most we've ever gained in a percentage growth standpoint was 1910 to 1920. We've never matched that in 100 years since then. So if we go down that road to establish a historic district, it would really be based on that growth period as a streetcar suburb when the streetcar was initiated from Newport out to the Fort, and then all the development happened right after that. That's kind of the context of how you define that historic district. If it contributed to that development after the streetcar was initiated, then it's historic. And if it wasn't part of that, it's probably not historic because the other elements that have to be, it's either was associated with a historic person, and I'm not aware that there was any really historic person that lived in any of those residences or houses. It has to be associated with a historic event. I don't know that there's really any historic events in Fort Thomas that would pertain to this case. Or there would be something that happened is a term of national significance, like 9/11 or something along those lines. So, as a historic district, our best context would be the development as a streetcar suburb in the 1920s. And so, but you have to go through and have somebody do that professionally and figure that out. And you know, my recommendation would be that we, as a city, do that.
Well, we've been talking about that for a long time, having someone come through and look at the buildings and decide what is historical and what isn't. We do have protections in place, and I think we need to leave those there until we have someone come through and really define what things are. So I don't want to take anything out that's already there. I want to make it strong, and then when we finally, because I think it's happening, and then they can educate us on how we can protect those things. But for now, I think
Right. Well, my understanding of this are actually two different things. Protecting the buildings we've got covered under our local historic district and design review board.
From a design
perspective. From the design side, which is what the concern is. The historic side is a different issue. It doesn't really affect what the design review board.
No, other than the fact that it's not a contributing building, we'd be hard pressed to say that we need a certificate of appropriateness from that historic building.
I'm sorry, what have we been doing for years? I didn't hear it.
Non-contributing buildings still getting a certificate of appropriateness for whatever changes they want to make.
Oh, I'm sorry, did One Highland get a certificate of appropriateness?
I know.
Oh, I didn't know you said you were doing it for you, I just wanted to know.
Anything else?
No, I would just say that in terms of next steps, we will draft some blue text incorporating the discussions tonight, potentially to go in front of the planning commission in July. And then our next step after that is that we will be dealing with the regulations that are applicable to all districts, things such as parking and that sort of thing. And we will be potentially doing that in August. Thank you all.
Wait, are we gonna have community questions?
Thank you for that explanation, that was very detailed.
Thank you for everything you've done in dealing with us and them and them.
Okay, we're now gonna open the floor for, public comments. We'll go down the list and
Peggy Maggio, 37 South Shaw Lane. I just want to start with the issue that Dan Arnold just brought up, because we discussed it in Planning Commission just this month. And it's the difference between a local historic district and the federal National Register of Historic Homes. And I talked to Beth Johnson, who appeared before you all. She's a historic preservationist in Cincinnati. What she explained to me was to be on the National Register of Historic Homes is an honor. It honors. A local historic district protects. And there's some intersection, but they're really two different things. I agree with Dave. I would love to see downtown here go on the National Register. I talked to Jody Robinson, who worked for the city at the time. She went on to become a preservationist for Bellevue. So for starters, we became a local protected historic district here in the CBD and in the Midway in 2002. In 2008, Jody said when we brought in a lot of the stuff that was in the fort. So they hired a consultant. She did that whole piece down there. And then Jody said they had that done. The appetite, was getting expensive. The appetite was not there to do anymore, so they just quit. Originally, they were going to do the Inverness, the CBD, and the Midway. But I agree. Let's do it. Let's get it on the National Register. Actually, Joan did a survey of all the homes up here in the CBD, all the buildings, and the vast majority, I believe, are from 1890 to 1910. Mm-hmm. A librarian here in town has done, who lived in all the buildings. So a lot of that started, but from my understanding, we need a consultant to figure that out. But that has nothing to do with the protection of the historic districts that we have in place, and they were done at 2 different times. So just to clarify that. But I just had a few questions, Lisa, for you actually. When we're looking, and this is going back to the CBD. So when we're looking at the 6 buildings here, the 6 homes, are you saying that those will revert to single family homes?
So can y'all hear me? So what the Planning Commission and the Council discussed tonight is allowing those to be a permitted use as a single family home if they existed the day the ordinance is passed. So if someone wanted to convert it from business on the first floor and residential on the second to a single family home, they would be permitted to do so. That's what they discussed tonight.
So, but what I heard getting bled in there was doing attached housing down the street.
So again, what we talked about was development standards that would require a setback and a division between the buildings, which is a separate issue from the use itself. But the use itself would become a permitted use based on this discussion.
So let's go back to the form then. The form that you're talking about for those 6 lots would include attached housing?
It would only include attached housing to the extent, if y'all want it, but we did not talk about townhouses being a permitted use tonight. All we did was talk about allowing it to be a permitted use for single family. That may be a discussion later. But what we did talk about at length was that there should be no long buildings and that there should be separation between buildings. But let's separate the fact that those buildings exist and are protected by the local historic district, which is a different issue than whether or not something else could be built there in terms of form.
Well, I agree, because in the design review guidelines, it specifically says that the setback, the height, and the proportionality has to be in relation to the buildings around there. But Elisa, I think you told us that there is a desirability to have the design review guidelines and the zoning like mesh. So we don't want to have zoning that allows for attached housing. The design review guidelines saying that it has to be the same proportionality, height, and setback is what we have right now.
So separate use from form.
Let's talk about form.
So potentially, let's just take the large house that is next to Fifth Third Bank at the corner of North Fort Thomas and
Forest.
And Forest.
Pending insurance.
Right, okay. So let's just take that as an example. What we talked about here was saying that the buildings had to have be constrained to have a certain width, but there would have to be separation between them. So on that lot, for example, if something happened to that home and someone wanted to put back, if they decided they wanted to do the townhouses, they potentially could have like 2 sets of townhouses, so 4 units, and still have the same built form, right? You would have space between the buildings and you would have a setback. So the form would be the same as what you currently have today if something happened to that house. But we did not have a discussion about use in terms of whether or not townhouses would be appropriate in that subdistrict. That's a conversation that we will be having later on. I delineated the conversation tonight into very discrete elements to help move the conversation along. But what was decided was that there would be no large attached buildings from essentially the Masonic Lodge, actually from Schoen all the way to Forest Avenue.
How do we fashion a zoning provision to have no attached housing at all?
And that is a use issue, and we did, as I said, we did not tackle that at all tonight. We did not tackle use, we have tackled form. And I realize that it seems like it's a very arbitrary distinction, but it is not. So what we tackled tonight was form, and we can tackle use as we move further into the process.
So as form, as was agreed tonight, there could in fact be attached housing.
We did not have that discussion. We didn't have that discussion.
Okay, so you did not, you didn't talk about
discuss it
that.
at all.
Okay.
All we talked about was decreasing the height,
Yep.
increasing the front setback, minimizing width, and requiring separation between buildings. We did not talk about use at all in that respect. The only way we talked about use was eliminating the prohibition of first floor residential in certain places, and then allowing those homes to be conforming uses. Those were the only 2 places where we discussed use.
Okay. Then the next question I had was, when we were talking about this side of the street, the east side of the street, you had talked about that wall. And in reality, that wall is just 2 blocks, right? It's from the Women's Club down to the Fort Thomas Board of Education, then starting again at, actually it's on this block, at the insurance agency and coming all the way down. So there's 2 blocks of walls. Otherwise, we have, would it be possible to do another sub-district down by US Bank, Guardian Savings Bank, and the post office, which is really a continuation of the avenue with the front, the generous front setbacks? Would it be possible to do a sub-district of that piece, from the Women's Club to Montvale to, like you say, to keep what we have on the ground right now, and to keep the avenue until we get to the Women's Club?
Certainly could. We did not, we purposely discussed today having it, for lack of a way of putting it, in purple, so that if redevelopment happens, given the fact that of the way the lots are laid out, that something could move closer to the street. But as we move through this discussion, if the board, once they see the standards, the board being the planning commission and the council, want to create a sub-district down there, they could. But that is a separate policy discussion at some point in time in the future.
And then just one last point, is it possible where the Ameristop is now? Because I know there's people on Miller and Lumley who are concerned. So Alicia, it's where the clock is, right now?
Yes.
That area and the area behind it, the parking lot. Mayor Hostin said that that's up for discussion for development. I know there's people on Miller and Lumley who are concerned. You have houses there about what goes in there. Is there a way to separate out that section so that what would go up there would have different standards and maybe what would be an edifice on the street?
So again, we didn't talk about that because that's a very different built environment than everything else. And I purposely left it out because it is a discussion unto itself.
Because I think it was part of the purple though, wasn't it?
The front of it was, but the front, but the back of it was not, as you get closer to Hagedorn. So that's again a policy discussion we will have later on, but I was trying to limit the discussion tonight as much as possible.
Thank you. And then just one thing, just to address the board and the council, I would just ask you as you go forward, and thank you tonight, I know it's late, but please consider what Elisa talked about, the built environment we have right now. That the built environment over here is single family homes right now. It's not townhomes. I don't think there's any appetite among anybody I've talked to in town for townhomes. And then also to continue the avenue where we have the avenue. you know, right now the avenue, and I'm talking about what Elise is gonna discuss, and she's gonna put an overlay on the avenue to keep the deep front yards. So I would just ask we keep the avenue up to the Masonic Lodge on the west side, and then keep the avenue up to the Women's Club on the east side, so that we continue to have our green space in Fort Thomas and have, you know, the Fort Thomas that we know and love. And then also, as we go forward, the areas that Mayor Haas talked about for development tonight. And those are US Bank, Guardian Savings Bank, and the post office, I think you mentioned. And then Mayor Haas also mentioned the area by the Ameristop, parking lot behind it, that type of development is done in a thoughtful way to the character of Fort Thomas, which, as Elisa said tonight, is 35 feet building. So I really appreciate you all looking at the height requirements and limitations. Thank you.
Joan Ferris.
Hi, Joan Ferris, 66 Burning. I had a prepared statement, but what I really want to do now instead of that is, there was a question when you were talking about expanding the boundaries in the midway section of the CBD. And I asked if those, I think there's 5 single, yes, were those included in the discussion tonight? Yes, and what was preliminary, I'm sorry, Joan, is there more to your question? You mentioned homes 2 slides back, I think, I might be able to, like Shawnee, there's like a couple of those houses there. I don't remember those 5 on South Fort Thomas Avenue being included in that, and I want a clarification on that. So what they discussed tonight was creating a sub-district for those 5 homes that would then allow them to be permitted uses and that would have different development standards from the rest of the area of the Midway, so that they could be exactly what they are today. Or what else? The only reason I'm asking that is, maybe they're single family. Well, 4 of them are. One of them is multifamily, the one on the corner. But that doesn't matter for this discussion. Okay, because I just know someone who lives there who, I mean, I understand it sounds like a rumor, but to her it doesn't, because they've been offered like big money to be able to do that and pretty much redo that whole block. And it just makes me curious as to, are we talking the big multi-family units, not meaning a 2-family, not meaning? No, if I understood both the council and the planning commission correctly tonight, what we were talking about was creating a sub-district that would mandate that the form that is there now, small buildings, a little bit of a setback, would be continue into the future. So we have development standards that would reflect that. That the ones that are single family would become permitted uses. And the reason they're not is because they're in CBD? Correct. Right now they're in the Central Business District. So and they would remain in the CBD? They would remain in the CBD, but they would be a sub-district within it that would reflect the existing built environment and use. Okay, but so still being in the CBD, being the local historic district, which again, yes, would then definitely still be in place for them. There's no, at least I didn't hear any conversation here tonight about either A, removing them from the CBD, or B, changing anything from what's there. What I heard was they wanted me to create a sub-district that reflects what's there and would keep it there. Did I misunderstand? Okay.
But the residential do not have to go in front of the DRB, correct?
So they have to go in front of the DRB today. They really do. No, the way the ordinance is drafted, they do, which is a whole different set of conversations. But yes, right now they would have to. Because of their being in the CBD, correct. If the improvement happens that's visible from South Fort Thomas. So yes, because they're in the Central Business District, if it's an alternate. Because I had heard last month at the zoning meeting about maybe removing them to shrink the local historic district into the national registry.
I guess what I was saying there is, for a certificate of appropriateness, now this gets back to the question I brought before, if it was determined that it wasn't historic previously, it's very difficult on historic terms to deny an alteration or a demolition permit if it's already been professionally determined that it's not historic and not a community building.
I Are you talking national historic, or are you talking?
I'm talking
local?
about national. If a local person wanted to redevelop, and it's not within the, it's not been designated as a contributing structure, it's very difficult to be able to enforce a certificate of appropriateness if it's already been professionally determined it's not historic.
So what is the local historic district protections which we are under, are they of their use?
I wouldn't say they're of no use, but they're subject to potential litigation. If somebody would choose to fight it, if it had already been surveyed and determined not to be historic. Now, you can still have design guidelines, but from a historic perspective, if the argument was those houses were historic, those 5 houses, and we can't change it because of some historic element of that house, and somebody already surveyed it and said it's not historic, you can't really go back, and the city can't just will itself and say it's a landmark or it's historic.
And that's a whole separate discussion from zoning.
I guess that stuns me.
That the protections that we've gotten.
It's all based on what a professional historian would say from a historic standpoint. You can, like we talked about, you can have the form, the dimensions, the type of roof, the setback, the windows, all that's not related to anything historical.
My hands up.
Thank you. Elizabeth Allegrini.
I'll defer till the end commenting to see if someone else is gonna bring up my topic.
Okay. Tiffany? I guess, Tiffany? I can't, sorry.
It's a long day.
I can't read your handwriting.
Sorry. So just a couple things from this meeting that I think we ought to be thinking about, especially as several of you brought up homeowners that abut these commercial properties. I really think that we do need to have in the zone, and I know that we spoke with this, or spoke about this a couple times, and that is having some significant, Lily, what did you call it, like a barrier, noise barrier, trees?
Buffering or something.
Buffering, yes. There does need to be a buffering, whether it's CBD or Midway or the south side of town or wherever it is. If it's close to residential, there needs to be some significant, if somebody's either adding on to their building or they're changing it all together. And I would say that that's true if it's general commercial or whatever, and if it impacts the residents of the town.
And that is the way it is today. There is buffering requirements today.
Maybe there should be a little bit more. Lots of trees, lots of green space, because that's really what we've been losing. So.
The question was, I think in the context we were talking about earlier, was if there was a house or a property that's in the CBD that we make it residential, then the adjacent lot all of a sudden is non-conforming because they don't have their buffer, because originally they wanted neighboring a residential.
Right.
So that was the question.
Yeah, and I think I'm just saying, I think we need more buffering if we're redoing our zoning code. And then, if we're looking to do any kind of residential on the first floor, I don't know how anybody feels about this, but we have residents in Fort Thomas who are not taking care of their homes or their houses, and this is single family. And I know that the city's been called on, I mean, I haven't called, but somebody has called the city, and I don't know what's going on with them, but I know it's not being taken care of. So either the fine's too low, or we're not really making them clean up their place. So all I'm saying is if we have zoning that in some of our major districts that we're trying to get people, to come in, we wanna make sure that those areas stay nice and that we have some enforcement. I thought we were gonna have some kind of a board that was gonna start enforcing that. Did I misunderstand
We have a
that?
board. If you have any specific issues, please email me or Sam Shelton and let us check on them. I can give you a status if we have or not.
And do we know what a fine for something like that is?
It all depends.
Okay, cause I know in Newport, like if you don't do something, I mean, your property is like, what do you call it when they take it away from you?
Foreclosed.
Yeah.
Yes, we have those working right now as well.
Okay. And then I'd just like to get a better idea of what kind of commercial things are we thinking where we're gonna need 3 floors? Because I've lived here, I mean, the majority of my entire life, and I have not seen these types of things come in or be successful. I'm just trying to understand as a resident, help me understand what would need 3 floors.
There's really no answer, that's market driven. And
Say that again?
It's all market driven, because a developer wants to buy some property and do something, and I think the comment was made earlier, the cost of building. If you're building a commercial structure, going up a floor is a lot cheaper than going to a bigger footprint. That's the only thing. It really has nothing to do, we don't have any control over that at all.
And so how do we balance that between what we're saying the residents want versus what the developers want?
That's what all this discussion is about.
I think a lot of it is dealt with by reducing the building. Because that, like, everybody's saying, oh, it doesn't look economically feasible to build something. That's why we're doing it. That's my opinion. You have the lower building height so that somebody doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, and the flip side, like I brought up earlier, Fort Thomas, and you yourself brought up about the fact that we're paying all these taxes for these, the IRBs and all these other development projects. But at the same time, Fort Thomas relies more heavily on our real estate taxes than most cities in northern Kentucky do. Because we don't have any commercial property, really, other than the hospital is really the only major employer we have.
Schools.
In the schools. But, generally, that's the balance you're trying to seek as well. The less commercial property you have, the more the city is relying on its residential property. And there's not a right answer to that question. But that's kind of when we were looking this back 20 years ago. That was, and this is all pre-COVID, which turned the whole commercial real estate industry on its head.
Yeah.
And to your point, how many people are going to come in and build a 3-story office building or a commercial building? Probably not going to happen anytime in the near future. But that was kind of the balance was to get more get more commercial property that was viable, that would help balance out that city tax rates at the time.
Okay, appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon.
Sharon McKnight, 62 Miller Lane. Thanks for staying here and talking amongst yourselves. I've asked this before, but I really think if we would have a historic preservation specialist, maybe train and sit down and talk to everybody so we understand what actually is protected and what the guidelines are, I think that would help everybody all around. Wouldn't that help you if you really understood what's protected and what you need a certificate of appropriateness for? Because I don't, and I look into it. He says one thing, the thing says, well, if it's in a historic district, you do need a certificate of appropriateness. So I think if we could get some kind of training for the public and for the board, I think that would be an excellent idea.
So, we talked about 3 weeks ago in the same room.
I know that, but nothing's happening.
We're gonna get through the budget this month and
Okay.
next month.
Okay, well, thank you for letting me suggest it again.
I know you'll sit on this next month.
See you in 2 weeks.
Dennis?
Sharon just took my thunder.
Okay. All right, there's no one else on the list? Okay. Elizabeth?
Elizabeth Allegrini, 45 Lockwood Place. Want to thank everybody. I know it's late, everybody wants to get home. Just a couple of things. One, I heard talk about the certificate of appropriateness. I know it's in the DRB guideline book, and it says that they're supposed to get certificate of appropriateness. So I know Mr. Beazle, Mr. Haas, you guys were on council when you guys approved One Highland. The certificates were not received. Whose responsibility was it to get those certificates and ensure that was done properly before they were torn down.
I have to take a look at it. I wasn't here when that all happened. I'm more than happy to sit down and take a look at it and see what happened. And I'll meet with you and talk about it. I don't know right now because I wasn't here.
There was a lot of interaction between the design review board and the developer. I don't know about.
There was not a formal certificate. However, the thought process was that the minutes reflected the formal approval. The minutes, their decisions, everything was finalized. There just wasn't a formal certificate.
That wouldn't hold up in a court of law. I'm just saying.
I think the motions, honestly, may. I think the motions were clear, they were concise, and they're saying exactly what the certificate of appropriateness would say.
Okay, fair enough. And I guess my next question is, council, you all have talked to the residents, and I think the overwhelming desire of them that you've talked to is that we like our city the way it is. And you have done a great job tonight by limiting, Andy, when you suggested you limit the height to 35 feet. That's great. And you know what? We don't want, one Highland, we got 2 condos sold. You said it's market driven, well, market plummeted. So that has cost our schools money.
That has not cost the schools money. That actually got them money, am I right? Andy, when we talked about that, just because the IRB
goes outside.
I just want to make sure we're all straight on that. They actually benefited from
No.
that because it lowered the tax base, which got them more money.
They got more of the state funding, but it's still less than
Right.
what we would have gotten.
Right. So we did lose money, and I've seen the analysis done, but I'm just pointing that out. But, so I look to council, because you guys are gonna have the final vote on this. Let's keep, in the business district, we've got businesses on the first floor, we've got residences on the second floor. That's what the majority of the businesses are. You set up those sub-districts to protect those houses. I think you need to take it further to prevent someone from buying all of them, putting narrow townhomes or whatever when that comes up. So I just look for you guys to continue to represent what the residents want. We should not have 1 or 2 people pushing an agenda for the city. And I think we've shown through our capabilities of a survey, we almost got more responses than the city did in the survey that they put out in 2.5 days. So I think that we need to continue to engage the residents, and you have people who have volunteered to help in this until we hire a communications director. So, thank you.
Thank you. All right, we are down to ordinances, resolutions, and orders.
One second. There was something that I don't think we got discussed tonight that we're supposed to. In the last council meeting, Henry and Strange brought up a point. They wanted to discuss the overviews of the design review board and what they were asking the overlays to be. Weren't we supposed to discuss that with
Yes.
planning and zoning? So that was the suggestion, was to discuss planning and zoning, because I know that they were adding another layer that would define design review board, or add more duties to their ordinance. I know that's what you guys discussed, and we haven't discussed. That was the whole point. That's one of the points of this meeting, was to figure out what they were trying to add to it. All I heard tonight was design review board. Design review boards is these single homes. Design review boards would determine this. Design review boards would determine that, and they're all single family homes. So I thought it sparked that was supposed to be part of the discussion. I don't know what the overlay you were going to add to their duties. Is that correct?
We certainly have the slides here. It was given late and I passed it.
So we've got till well in the next year, and we're going to have these meetings. We just can't capture it.
Yeah, but the whole point of that discussion was to decide whether or not how the vote was, whether non-residents versus residents being on business owners, non-residents being on the board.
Yeah, but we still don't know until here.
Table until this discussion to find out what.
I thought it was tabled until the guidelines are clear.
No.
Yeah, because we haven't decided, you're talking about the scope of the DRB.
Yeah, well, that's what,
And that's still, they're still in the planning of determining officially that.
Okay, so then that whole discussion is gonna be held off.
It'll be tabled until.
Okay.
Yeah, so once they figure out what they wanna do, to inform us what that is, so we're informed to make the vote, but we don't make the vote until that takes place.
Just what- I thought we were gonna talk about that at tonight's meeting too, so.
It could be, but.
I'm fine either way.
We'll pick it up, I mean.
Once you guys finalize it, or once you guys bring something to us, I thought that was part of it.
Is that okay?
Alright, ordinance 011.
An ordinance amending a general fund budget for the city of Fort Thomas, Campbell County, Kentucky, for the fiscal year 7/1/2022 through 6/30/2023, by estimating revenues and resources and appropriating funds for the operation of city government.
First reading. Okay. Ordinance 12.
An ordinance adopting a general fund budget, municipal road aid fund budget, debt service fund budget, capital project CBD fund, health insurance fund, and waste disposal fund budget for the city of Fort Thomas, Campbell County, Kentucky, for the fiscal year 7/1/2023 through 6/30/2024, by estimating revenues and resources and appropriating funds for the operation of city government.
Alright, also first reading, ordinance 014/2023.
It's 14 or 13.
This says 14, but I don't know whether it says, oh, yes. It was, yeah, it's 13. My apologies, I have two different versions here.
An ordinance amending the personnel and pay classification plan by unilaterally increasing the official pay table by 8%, effective on July 1/2023, and amending the compensation ranges for various positions.
Another first reading, municipal order MO7.
The necessary information was not provided to council yet to vet that individual, so we could.
No, they called them.
We didn't call them yet, I didn't have a chance to call them.
Yeah.
Oh, is that?
Yeah, so
Okay.
that's what I was talking about, we're going to do next in 2 weeks.
I didn't get to it. I don't know if any of us did that yet.
Alright, and we have nothing else on the agenda, thank you all for being here tonight. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Everybody's.
Say aye.
You wanna stick around?
I was